There was a kitchen in your family where the stove never got cold. Somebody's grandmother stood over a cast iron skillet before the sun came up, making something from almost nothing, and the whole house smelled like home. Pork neck bones simmering in a pot, cornbread baking in bacon grease, peach cobbler cooling on the counter while somebody tried to sneak a spoonful before supper. Those recipes lived in her hands, not in any cookbook. She learned them from her mother, who learned them from hers, going all the way back to women who cooked through the Depression, through Jim Crow, through decades when making a meal meant making do. Most of those dishes are gone now. The women who made them are gone, and nobody thought to write it down. Here are 100 lost African American recipes your grandparents knew. Sit back and take your time with this one. Number 20, okra soup with crab. The word okra traces back to the Igbo word okuru. The plant came to the low country from West Africa in the holds of slave ships, and it thrived in the Carolina heat. Gullah cooks built entire soups around it, adding whatever the creeks provided. The Charleston version used blue crab, pulled apart by hand, the shells left in the pot to deepen the broth. Okra acted as both vegetable and thickener, its natural mucilage giving the soup a body no flour roux could match. This was a summer dish made when okra peaked and crabs were running. Health-conscious cooks in the 1990s rejected the texture of cooked okra, and the soup lost a generation of eaters who never came back. Every dish on this list shares one trait that no Charleston history book acknowledged for 200 years. The crops are African, the techniques are African, the one-pot method, the reliance on rice as a foundation, all of it traces back to the Senegambian coast, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast. Enslaved Africans did not simply provide labor in the low country. They provided knowledge. They knew which soils grew rice. They knew how to manage tidal irrigation. They knew how to turn a handful of okra and a few crabs into a meal that could feed a family. The cookbooks that made low country cuisine famous were written by white women who employed black cooks. The recipes traveled upward. The credit did not. Number 17, crackling bread. A clay-lined yard in Macon, Georgia, on the first cold morning of November 1939, smelled of wood smoke and rendered hog fat. The men of the family had killed a hog at first light. The grandmother stood at a long plank table, cutting fat back into thumb-sized squares and dropping them into a heavy iron kettle. The water cooked off in 20 minutes. The fat began to render. The little squares of skin and meat shrank and crisped and turned the color of oak leaves in October. She lifted them out with a slotted spoon and laid them on a wooden board to drain. These were the cracklings. They held a year of seasoning for a family that owned almost nothing else of value. She set aside 2 cups for bread. The rest she packed into mason jars for trading at the corner store. What most people miss about hog killing time is the trade economy that ran on rendered fat. A jar of cracklings bought a dozen eggs that winter. A jar bought a pound of coffee. The bread itself was simple: white cornmeal, buttermilk, baking soda, an egg from the hen house, and the cracklings folded in at the last minute. She poured the batter into a hot skillet swimming with bacon fat and slid it into a wood-fired oven. 40 minutes later, the crust was the color of bourbon. The inside was studded with crisp pork that crunched when you bit through. She cut the bread into 8 wedges and set it beside a pot of collard greens. Crackling bread was hog-killing time food. It was the bread that said the family had survived another summer of credit at the furniture store and would eat through another winter on whatever the hog had given. Her great-granddaughter still bakes it the same way. The skillet is the same skillet. The recipe was never written down. It moved from her hands into her daughter's hands, into her granddaughter's hands the way prayer moves through a family. It does not need paper to survive. Number 16, boiled peanuts. The green peanut came out of the field in late summer, still in its odd, damp shell before it had a chance to dry. It was washed, dropped into a pot of heavily salted water, and simmered for 4 hours until the shell turned soft and the kernel inside was a little tender and a little briny, like a small pickled bean. The cook tasted one every 30 minutes until the salt was right. A child on John's Island would eat them by the handful out of a paper cone and spit the soft shells into the dirt road. They were your porch snack, a long drive snack, a churchyard snack. Almost nothing else in American food eats like a boiled peanut. They are warm, salty, soft, and faintly sweet at the same time. A pound of green peanuts cost $0.10 in 1960. A bowl could keep your porch full of cousins quiet for an hour.
Salt pork gravy over bread was one of those breakfasts created from necessity. Yet it tasted like something that belonged in a country diner. Grandparents would fry slices of salt pork until the fat rendered out and the meat crisped, releasing a savory aroma that meant a hearty meal was on the way. The drippings were whisked with flour and milk to create a thick, salty gravy that clung to the spoon, rich and filling despite its humble ingredients. Poured over toast or biscuits, it transformed simple bread into something warm and deeply satisfying. This was a breakfast made for long days and empty pockets, a way to stretch flavor as far as it could go. Children did not think about thrift. They just knew the gravy tasted good and made the morning feel special. The saltiness, the creaminess, and the soft bread soaking up every drop created a combination that lingered in both taste and memory. It was the kind of meal that carried families through tough times and still managed to feel generous. Even today, people who grew up with salt pork gravy remember it with a fondness that nothing else can quite match. Blackberry cobbler dumplings were different from modern cobblers, made by dropping biscuit dough directly into bubbling berry juice. Black mothers would cook wild blackberries with sugar until the fruit broke down and released its juices, then drop spoonfuls of thick biscuit dough into the hot liquid. The dumplings steamed and puffed, becoming tender inside while developing slightly crusty tops. The result was somewhere between dumpling and cobbler, with soft dough soaking up berry juice. In the 1920s, blackberry picking was a summer ritual, with children gathering berries from wild patches and returning home with stained fingers. Mothers made cobbler dumplings because they required less flour than traditional cobbler, stretching resources while still creating something special. The dessert was eaten warm, sometimes with cream or milk poured over. It represented the brief window of berry season and the joy of turning foraged fruit into celebration. The technique has been replaced by easier cobbler methods, but the original dumpling version had a texture and character all its own. Cowpea soup simmered like a prayer whispered over a fire. The pot would start with water, a scoop of dried field peas, and maybe a scrap of salted meat if the week had been kind. Onions and garlic joined in, releasing their scent as the broth thickened into something golden and strong. The cowpeas, small and sturdy, softened slowly, their flavor deepening with every hour. This wasn't fast food, it was patient food, built on rhythm and time. Families made it during harvest, when work was hard and hands needed warmth. It was ladled into tin bowls and passed around without ceremony, each bite grounding you in gratitude. Sometimes cornbread floated on top like an offering, soaking up the last drops of broth. The soup tasted of earth and labor, of simple things done well. Cowpea soup was both meal and memory, tying together generations who had learned how to make plenty out of little. It was food for body and spirit alike, humble but whole, strong but soothing. Even now, its scent carries the same promise, that comfort comes from what you give, not what you have. Apple brown. Betty with stale bread was the quiet triumph of thrift, a dessert that turned yesterday's scraps into something worthy of company. Old loaves were torn into pieces, layered with sliced apples, sugar, and butter. then baked until the kitchen smelled like home itself. The bread soaked up the apple juices and syrup, becoming tender and golden at once, with just enough crisp at the top to remind you that life could still surprise you. It was food for people who didn't waste a thing, for those who found sweetness in the ordinary. The dish required no exact recipe, just instinct, warmth, and what was on hand. Some added cinnamon or molasses if they had it. Others simply let the apples speak for themselves. Each bite was familiar, comforting, and honest. Apple Brown Betty was proof that love, like flavor, could bloom even from what was left behind. Cabbage and smoked sausage skillet was the scent of supper in a small kitchen, where warmth came from both the stove and the hearts that gathered near it. Thick slices of sausage hit the skillet first, browning beside a handful of onions until the air filled with a smoky sweetness that made the day's weariness disappear. Then the cabbage joined in, hissing as it met the heat, wilting down to tenderness in its own steam. Everything cooked together in the same pan, sharing flavor, grease, and gratitude. It was a one-pan meal that stretched far beyond its humble ingredients. The cabbage made the meat go further, the sausage gave the greens their soul, and the two together became the definition of comfort. Black mothers in the 1940s turned this simple pairing into something beautiful, hearty, fragrant, and proud. They cooked with instinct, adding nothing they did not need, wasting nothing that still held worth. Served with cornbread or a bowl of rice, it was more than food. It was reassurance that even after the hardest day, home was still here. The sound of sausage sizzling in the evening light was music, soft and steady, reminding everyone that love could be tasted. Onion skin tea was one of those old remedies that could quiet both body and soul. When someone had a cough or a fever, or when food simply ran out, a pot of this humble tea came to the rescue. Dried onion skins were gathered from the corners of the kitchen, rinsed and steeped in boiling water until the liquid turned golden brown. The scent was sharp but comforting, a mix of earth and sweetness that filled the air with warmth. Some added honey if they had it, or a squeeze of lemon, but even plain, it had its own charm. People believed it could heal and strengthen, and maybe it did, because hope itself can be medicine. Onion skin tea was born from patience, brewed by hands that knew how to stretch every last bit of life from what they had. It was the taste of resilience and care, a sip that made you believe tomorrow might be gentler. Onion and pepper rice offered a fast path to a filling supper when time and ingredients were scarce. Leftover rice was tossed into a sizzling skillet with diced onions and bright bell peppers, the vegetables releasing their aroma as they softened. A drizzle of oil or a spoonful of bacon fat coated each grain, while a pinch of salt and a shake of pepper brought the flavors together. In under 10 minutes, the humble mix became a colorful, fragrant dish that could stand alone or serve as a hearty side. Families relied on this quick stir-fry to stretch yesterday's pot of rice into a fresh new meal, ensuring nothing went to waste. The sweet bite of onion and the gentle heat of peppers gave each spoonful a lively taste that felt far from leftover. This simple yet vibrant recipe showed how a few minutes and a hot pan could transform plain rice into something satisfying and comforting, a bright spark of flavor in kitchens that valued every grain. Forage mushrooms didn't always lining our burgers and topping our pizzas. For a majority of its history, it was really just something people ate when things were super bad. There was nothing to eat and people basically just had to forage for whatever they could. The most popular of this was the button mushroom, but they definitely tried to forage as much as they could. Now, despite this, mushrooms were still considered really low class. People had just begun to associate it with nothing but poverty and hard times. It wasn't until the middle and the later end of the 20th century that mushrooms started to become a classic topping you'd see on not just burgers and pizzas, but steaks, chicken dishes, sandwiches, and all kinds of soups and stews. Basically, it's a mushroom world, and we're just living in it now. A big part of this is how canned mushrooms became so accessible. Another reason is that an interest in European cuisine led to a massive boom in cream of soups and cream of mushroom soups. Share some of your favorite mushrooms with us right now in the comments. Pigtail and lima bean stew was slow food in its truest form, built on time, patience, and thrift. Pigtails were boiled for hours, their marrow-rich flavor turning water into a broth so deep it could stand alone. Lima beans simmered alongside, soaking in the salt and smoke until they burst open, creamy and thick. The stew bubbled low on wood stoves, perfuming small kitchens with the smell of comfort and labor. Nothing fancy went into it, yet it carried the fullness of a feast, rich enough to make the poorest table feel blessed. Pigtail and lima bean stew was a recipe that taught patience, how to wait, how to stir, how to coax flavor from bone and bean. It was a dish for families who knew that good food took time, and time itself was a kind of love. When served, it clung to cornbread and filled bowls to the rim. The meat fell apart, the beans melted soft, and every spoonful told the story of making much out of little. Pigtail and lima bean stew was more than sustenance. It was gratitude made edible. Hog maw was one of the most resourceful dishes in African American kitchens, turning a pig's stomach into something hearty and sustaining. The stomach was carefully cleaned, then stuffed with potatoes, onions, sausage, or other fillings before being stewed slowly. What might have been discarded elsewhere became a centerpiece dish, full of flavor and nourishment. Families appreciated hog maw because it made use of every part of the animal, a practice born from necessity during slavery and carried forward through generations. It was especially common during holidays or gatherings, when stretching ingredients to feed many was essential. The dish carried strong flavors with seasonings and fat infusing the filling as it cooked. Children often learned early on that nothing should be wasted, and hog maw embodied that lesson clearly. Though less common today, it once stood as a symbol of thrift and tradition, proving that every cut had value. Forgotten now, hog maw was a dish of pride as much as necessity. Stewed goat was a dish that echoed the Caribbean roots of many African American communities, carried forward by migration and memory. Goat meat was lean, flavorful, and often cheaper than beef or pork, making it a practical choice for households on tight budgets. When simmered slowly with peppers, onions, garlic, and spices, the meat became tender and rich, filling pots with a savory aroma that promised comfort. The dish varied across families, some adding tomatoes or potatoes, others flavoring it with hot peppers for extra kick, but the essence remained the same: resourcefulness meeting tradition. Goat connected communities to African and Caribbean foodways where the animal had long been central to celebrations and everyday meals alike. For African American families, cooking goat became a way of holding on to heritage while also making do with what was available in American markets. It was often served with rice or cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, ensuring nothing was wasted. Stewed goat symbolized survival, culture, and the continuity of traditions that might otherwise have been lost. For those who remember it, the taste remains tied to family, identity, and the strength of memory in African American kitchens. Giblet gravy over rice was a dish that proved every part of a chicken had value and nothing could be wasted. The giblets, often discarded by wealthier households, were simmered with onions, seasonings, and broth until tender. When poured over a bed of rice, the mixture became a rich, satisfying meal that carried families through many nights. It was cheap to make, since giblets were often sold for little or simply included with whole chickens, and rice stretched it into a dish that filled bellies. For African American households, it represented ingenuity and respect for food, a refusal to discard what could still provide nourishment. The gravy was flavorful, hearty, and comforting, reminding families that meals did not need expensive cuts to feel indulgent. It became a tradition at many tables, where the sauce transformed plain rice into something savory and memorable. For children growing up, the smell of giblet gravy often meant home and warmth. Even though it has faded from popularity today, it was once a cornerstone of thrifty, creative cooking. Its legacy endures as proof that frugality and flavor could walk hand in hand in kitchens shaped by necessity. Candied yams with marshmallow topping were once the crown jewel of holiday dinners, a dish that sparkled with sweetness and warmth. Thick slices of sweet potatoes were baked in sugar and butter until tender, then topped with marshmallows that toasted to golden perfection under the oven's heat. The combination was indulgent, rich, and festive, making it a favorite at Thanksgiving and Christmas tables. Children loved the gooey marshmallow topping, while adults enjoyed the contrast of savory meals balanced with this sweet side. For African American families, it was more than just dessert disguised as a side dish. It was tradition, a recipe that appeared year after year as part of holiday identity. Candied yams symbolized celebration and togetherness, proof that special occasions deserved special food. Though modern tables sometimes replace it with simpler versions, the classic marshmallow topping remains iconic. It was a dish that carried nostalgia, joy, and pride, reminding families of holidays past and the flavors that defined them. Every bite was tied to memory, laughter, and the spirit of gathering.
Number 15, sesame-crusted whiting. Gullah cooks on the sea islands dredged fresh whiting, not in cornmeal alone, but in a mixture of cornmeal and crushed bene seeds, then fried it in hot lard until the coating turned golden and the sesame cracked between the teeth. The combination married two West African staples, sesame and fresh-caught fish, in a preparation that had no European equivalent. Whiting was cheap and abundant in the Low Country, showing up in cast nets and off docks. The bene coating elevated it into something with a distinctive, almost smoky flavor. The practice faded as commercial fish, frying standardized coatings to cornmeal alone. Sesame lost. Most Low Country fish fryers today have never considered putting a bene seed near a piece of whiting. Number 19, sardines on saltine crackers. A retired porter in Jackson, Mississippi, came home from his last shift on the Illinois Central in 1958 and ate the same supper he had carried in his lunch sack for 30 years. One can of King Oscar sardines packed in mustard sauce, a sleeve of saltine crackers from the cardboard tube, a glass of water from the kitchen tap. He laid the crackers out on a napkin like a hand of solitaire, spooned sardines on top, and ate them slow at the kitchen table while the radio played gospel from a Memphis station. The whole supper cost him 15 cents. He ate it 3 nights a week until 1981. If you watched a black grandfather of that generation eat his quiet weeknight supper, you watched this exact plate. His doctor told him at age 84 that his cholesterol numbers belonged to a man of 50. He never made the connection. Number 19, Sapelo Island sugarcane syrup biscuits. The cane that mattered here was purple ribbon, an heirloom variety that grew thick and dark on the small island farms. By 1996, it had nearly disappeared from the South entirely, and most cooks today would tell you they've never tasted it. Cornelia Walker Bailey, the Geechee griot of Hog Hammock, fought to bring it back. She and a small group of cuisine revivalists planted purple ribbon on her farm and at Georgia Coastal Gourmet Farms in nearby Shellman Bluff. The cane was cut by hand in the cool months, crushed in a mule-driven press older than her grandfather, and boiled down for hours in a wide iron kettle over a wood fire. The syrup that came out was almost black, with a flavor halfway between molasses and burnt sugar, the way only slow fire can build. Mrs. Bailey used it in biscuits the way her mother had. The dough was simple: self-rising flour, a spoon of lard, buttermilk, salt, rolled, cut, baked hot. While they baked, she warmed purple ribbon syrup in a small saucepan with a sliver of butter. When the biscuits came out, she split each one open and poured the warm syrup directly into the steaming center. The biscuit collapsed slightly under the weight, like cloth folding. The syrup soaked into every crumb. A child on Sapelo would hold the saucer with both hands and tilt the syrup toward the lower half so nothing was wasted. Mrs. Bailey passed in 2017. The cane she rescued still grows on her farm. The biscuits are still served at the small store on the island. They are the closest thing to a time machine Sea Island cooking has produced.
Stewed apples over grits was the quiet morning comfort many families turned to when fresh fruit was limited, but preserved apples were always within reach. grandparents would slice apples thin and let them simmer with sugar or syrup until they softened into a fragrant golden mixture that tasted like fall in every season. Meanwhile, a pot of grits bubbled on the stove, thickening slowly as it absorbed the heat. When the stewed apples were spooned over the top, the contrast of creamy grits and sweet fruit felt like a small luxury. It was warm, filling, and gentle, the kind of breakfast that soothed the stomach and the spirit. Some families added cinnamon, others added butter, but most kept it simple because the apples were already sweet enough. This dish was a reminder of home orchards, backyard trees, and jars of preserves lined up on pantry shelves. It tasted like patience and tradition, like the kind of mornings where time moved slower. Even today, stewed apples over grits feels like a forgotten treasure from a quieter time. Lye hominy was ancient food, made by soaking dried corn in lye water until the kernels swelled and their hulls loosened. Black mothers learned this process from indigenous peoples and African traditions, creating food that was more nutritious than regular corn. The process began with making lye from wood ashes, then soaking field corn for days until the kernels transformed into pale, ghostly white hominy. After rinsing away all traces of lye, the hominy was boiled until tender. The taste was earthy and slightly mineral, with a chewy texture that satisfied hunger like nothing else. In the 1920s, hominy appeared regularly on black tables because it turned cheap field corn into something substantial. Mothers fried hominy in bacon grease for breakfast, creating crispy cakes that children ate with molasses. They stewed it with meat for dinner. Lye hominy represented knowledge passed through generations, showing that food preparation was both science and art. The technique has mostly disappeared, replaced by canned hominy that lacks the texture of the hand-processed original. Mustard greens with cornmeal dumplings were the kind of meal that warmed both the body and the soul. The greens simmered low in a pot of broth, their bitterness mellowed by time and a scrap of salt meat if fortune allowed. Then came the dumplings, cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt mixed by hand and dropped into the bubbling pot. They soaked up the flavor, swelling into tender pillows that turned broth into sustenance. The smell filled the home with earthy comfort, the kind that came from gardens and grit. It was a dish made from what was on hand, proof that no pantry was ever too bare for a good meal. Families gathered around the pot, sharing bowls of steaming greens that tasted like nourishment and memory. The broth, rich and golden, was sipped down to the last drop. Mustard greens with cornmeal dumplings reminded everyone that simplicity could still be a feast. It was food for working hands and grateful hearts, born of scarcity but seasoned with love. Vinegar cobbler was born out of clever desperation, a pie made without fruit when fruit was nowhere to be found. During lean times, cooks discovered that a few spoonfuls of vinegar could mimic the tang of apples or berries when mixed with sugar and spice. The filling bubbled golden beneath a biscuit crust, the scent of caramel and acid mingling in the air. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like luxury to those who made it. Every bite was tart, sweet, and full of resilience, a dessert that turned an empty pantry into abundance. The vinegar balanced the sweetness perfectly, fooling even those who didn't know the secret. For families scraping by, this dish was proof that imagination could be as nourishing as food itself. Vinegar cobbler might have vanished from modern tables, but in its time, it was a triumph of spirit baked into a humble pie dish. Sweet potato coffee pie was invention shaped by need and imagination. During wartime rationing, coffee beans were scarce, so black mothers found new ways to bring that same warmth to the table. Sweet potatoes, brown sugar, and spice became the answer. Mashed and mixed with brewed grounds or instant powder, they baked into a pie that smelled like roasted beans and earth. The result was deep, rich, and comforting. The flavor of coffee without the luxury of it. Each slice was soft, creamy, and filled with quiet pride. This dessert proved that creativity could fill the gaps left by scarcity. It carried both the taste of survival and the joy of sweetness earned through effort. Families served it after church or on special occasions when gathering meant more than feasting. The pie cooled on the windowsill, golden and fragrant, while children waited for the first cut. Sweet potato coffee pie was more than resourcefulness. It was resilience baked in a crust. It turned shortage into sweetness, hardship into history, reminding every bite that love never ran out. It only adapted. Sorrel leaf stew was the taste of home for generations who carried their roots wherever life took them. The wild green leaves, bright and tangy, grew freely along fences and fields, waiting for careful hands to gather them. Washed and simmered with onions, garlic, and a little oil, they softened into a dark green broth that shimmered in the pot. Sometimes salted pork or dried fish bones were added for depth, but even without them, the stew stood proud. Its flavor was sharp and earthy, sour and comforting all at once. For families from the coastal South and Caribbean, this dish was not just food. It was a memory of sunlight, laughter, and work well done. It was a taste of mothers stirring pots over open fires, of children running barefoot through red dirt yards. Sorrel leaf stew reminded everyone that strength grew from soil and struggle, that flavor could come from the simplest gift of the land. When a spoon dipped into that steaming bowl, it carried the sound of old prayers and soft voices calling people to eat. In every swallow lived the rhythm of survival, steady and sure, like the ocean tides that shaped those who first made it. Field pea stir-fry turned leftover peas into a 10-minute marvel, saving both time and precious ingredients. Pre-cooked field peas were tossed into a hot skillet with diced onions and small cubes of smoked salt pork, the fat sizzling as it released a savory aroma. A quick splash of vinegar or a grind of black pepper added brightness while the peas heated through, soaking up the smoky flavor. The dish went from cold to steaming in less time than it took to set the table, offering a hearty side or even a full meal with a piece of bread. For families working long days in the fields, this recipe fit perfectly between dawn chores and midday labor, delivering protein and comfort without delay. The simple combination of earthy peas and salty pork made each bite deeply satisfying, proof that even the humblest leftovers could be reborn into something new and memorable with only a hot pan and a few quick turns of the spoon. If you believe that using every part of the animal is a modern concept, you are mistaken. Dust Bowl families were not sparing any part of the pig, including the snout. Pig snouts breaded might sound like something you dare a friend to eat, but during the Great Depression, it was a delicacy. When meat was a rare commodity, the snout was a cheap source of something meaty, chewy, and quite palatable. The snouts were washed, cooked until soft, and then breaded before being deep-fried to golden brown. The result? A crispy outside and a very tasty meat on the inside. Well, yes, the texture may have been somewhat unusual, but when you are hungry, you don't mind. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. To Dust Bowl families, pig snouts breaded were not just edibles, but a way to pay tribute to every pound of what little they had. No part was wasted, while such meals ensured that scarcity became resourcefulness. Nowadays, breaded pig snouts can be found only in some culinary forums, but they are a vivid example of how people tried to feed themselves when there were no chips, but snouts. Would I try it? To put it in perspective, if my grandma was to prepare it with a wink and a smile, I'd be willing to take a bite. Indeed, when you survive, you become brave and perhaps a little curious. But would you try it? Leave us the answer in the comments below. Collard green sandwiches were the working person's lunch, built for long days and calloused hands. Cold collard greens, left over from the night before, were pressed between thick slabs of cornbread still warm from the skillet. Sometimes there was bacon grease brushed inside for flavor, sometimes just salt and love. It was food meant to travel, sturdy, filling, and easy to eat between shifts or in the shade of a field. Every bite was smoky, tangy, and satisfying, a little taste of home wrapped in practicality. You did not need silverware or a plate, only the will to keep going. These sandwiches held the spirit of the South's hardest workers, people who made do with what they had, and still made it taste like something fine. The greens gave strength, the bread gave comfort, and together they carried families through hard seasons. Collard green sandwiches were humble, yes, but they fed both body and pride. They proved that even leftovers could tell a story of perseverance and belonging. Rice fritters were another ingenious way African American families stretched meals, turning leftovers into something fresh and delicious. Leftover rice from the night before would be mixed with eggs, flour, and seasonings, then shaped into small patties and fried until golden. The result was crispy on the outside, tender inside, and surprisingly filling. Sometimes onions or herbs were added, but even plain, rice fritters made the most of what little was available. They transformed yesterday's scraps into a hot breakfast or quick side dish, showing how nothing went to waste. This recipe reflected both thrift and creativity, values passed down across generations. It also connected to African traditions of frying grains into cakes, a continuity that survived through adaptation. Rice fritters were especially popular in communities where rice was abundant, linking Southern kitchens to centuries of heritage. Today they are rarely seen, but once they were symbols of resilience and invention. Forgotten now, rice fritters stand as a reminder of how African American cooking honored both survival and culture. Crab stew was a coastal dish that reflected the way African American families used every bit of what the sea could offer. Small crabs, often too little to sell for high prices, were simmered whole in pots of broth with onions, rice, and seasonings. The crabs infused the stew with a deep, briny flavor, while the rice made it hearty enough to feed large families. This dish was common in low-country communities where fishing and crabbing were part of daily survival. Families passed down recipes that varied from house to house, sometimes thickened with okra or flavored with tomatoes, but always built on the same principle of stretching limited seafood into abundance. Crab stew was not only nourishing, it was also communal, often cooked in big pots for gatherings and shared among neighbors. It symbolized the connection between African American communities and the coastal land that sustained them, even when access to more desirable cuts of seafood was denied. For those who remember it, crab stew was a dish of both necessity and pride, filled with flavor that told the story of resilience. Dandelion root coffee was a clever stand-in for real coffee when families could not afford imported beans. Roots were dug from fields, scrubbed clean, roasted until dark, then ground and brewed like traditional coffee. The drink was bitter, earthy, and aromatic, providing the ritual of coffee without the expense. It carried traces of African and native herbal traditions where plants were used for both sustenance and healing. While it offered no caffeine, it still brought comfort, warmth, and a sense of normalcy to mornings. During wartime shortages, when substitutes were a necessity, this drink became even more common in kitchens that needed alternatives. It was not simply about flavor, but about survival, proving families could create something out of weeds that grew freely. For those who drank it, dandelion root coffee was a symbol of resilience, turning scarcity into familiarity and making hardship feel just a little easier to endure. Fried cowpeas were a farm favorite that turned a humble legume into a crunchy, savory snack. Freshly picked peas were boiled briefly, then drained, seasoned, and fried until crisp. The result was a side dish that had both texture and flavor, something different from ordinary boiled peas. Families served them with meats or enjoyed them as a simple snack between meals, proof that nothing from the harvest went to waste. Cowpeas were abundant in southern gardens, and frying them gave variety to daily meals. Children loved the crisp bite, while adults appreciated the thrift and creativity of the recipe. It was a dish tied to summer, when gardens overflowed and kitchens found clever ways to use every bit. Over time, fried cowpeas faded as convenient snacks and packaged foods replaced farm kitchen ingenuity. But once they were a beloved reminder of abundance and resourcefulness, showing how even the simplest crops could be transformed into something special.
Number 19, mullet and grits. This was the fisherman's breakfast on the sea islands, and the fishing method that produced it was older than anything European settlers brought to the coast. Gula men threw cast nets from the shallows, a circular weighted net flung by hand in a motion that required years of practice. The technique came directly from West Africa, where fishermen along the coasts of Senegal and Sierra Leone had used cast nets for centuries. The mullet they caught in low-country tidal creeks were bony, oily fish that most white Charlestonians considered trash. Gullah families knew better. A whole mullet, scaled and gutted, fried in lard in a cast iron skillet until the skin blistered and the bones went soft enough to chew. Served alongside a mound of grits cooked in the fish's own drippings, it was a complete meal that cost nothing but time and skill. The cast net was not a tool anyone could pick up and use. It required a specific wrist motion, a feel for the wind, an understanding of where mullets schooled at what tide. Fathers taught sons, uncles taught nephews. The knowledge was embodied, not written. When commercial fishing operations expanded along the Carolina coast in the 1960s and 1970s, the small boat cast net fishermen who had worked these waters for generations were pushed to the margins. Mullet became bait fish in the eyes of the market. The breakfast disappeared with the fishermen who caught it. On a few sea islands today, older men still throw cast nets at dawn, but the young men standing behind them are tourists learning a skill for the afternoon, not sons learning a trade for life. The tradition is measured in single digits now, not generations. Number 21, neck bone and cabbage pot. A pot the size of a wash basin sat on a kerosene stove in a rented room in Detroit in 1947. The grandmother had carried 2 pounds of beef neck bones home from the Eastern market in a paper sack stained dark with blood. She covered them with cold water and dropped in a head of cabbage cut in quarters and a yellow onion split in half. 3 hours later, the bones gave up their meat in soft brown shreds, the way a tightly wound fist finally opens. The cabbage went translucent. The broth turned the color of weak coffee. She fed 5 people from that one pot and saved the broth for the next morning. If you grew up in a northern tenement after 1940, you know that smell hit your nose before you even climbed the stairs. Neck bone and cabbage was Great Migration food. It was the dish that made a tenement kitchen smell like home. Number 22, Geechee fried fish breakfast. The whiting came in at first light, gutted on the dock, walked back to the kitchen in a galvanized pail. The fillet was rolled in fine yellow cornmeal, seasoned with salt, black pepper, and a whisper of cayenne. It went into a cast iron pan of hot lard and crisped on each side in 3 minutes. Beside it on the plate, soft white grits. Beneath it, a piece of cornbread to catch the oil. This was breakfast, not toast, not cereal, not anything you could buy at a counter. A boy on St. Helena ate it before walking 2 miles to the Penn School in 1948, and he considered himself well fed. The fish cost nothing. The cornmeal cost almost nothing. The lard came from a hog the family slaughtered themselves the previous winter.
Sorghum syrup on hot biscuits was a rural breakfast tradition rooted in the fields and farms where sorghum was grown and milled long before maple syrup ever became common. The syrup was thick, earthy, and rich, with a sweetness that felt deeper than sugar. Grandparents would split open hot biscuits, steam rising, and drizzle sorghum across the soft center until it glistened. The flavor was bold and comforting, slightly smoky, and entirely unique. It tasted like the land itself, like seasons of harvest and the steady work of hands that knew how to make every ingredient count. Biscuits with sorghum were inexpensive, filling, and quietly indulgent in their own rustic way. Families loved them because the syrup lasted long, cost little, and carried the taste of home. Even today, those who grew up with sorghum syrup remember its distinct sweetness with a kind of affection that never fades. Cracklings were once treasured more than candy, made from rendering pork fat until crispy golden bits floated in pure lard. Black mothers would cut fat back or pork skin into small pieces and cook them slowly in cast iron pots, stirring constantly as the fat melted away. The bits turned crispy, salty, and impossibly rich, eaten hot from the pot or saved for cornbread batter. Children begged for cracklings, and mothers portioned them carefully, knowing they provided essential calories and flavor. The rendered lard was saved for cooking everything from biscuits to vegetables. In 1920s Black households, cracklings meant the hog had been butchered and winter provisions were secured. They were celebratory food tied to community hog killings where neighbors gathered. Mothers mixed cracklings into cornbread, creating pone studded with salty, crunchy bits. They stirred them into greens and packed them for lunches. Though still made in some communities, the art of rendering fat and saving every crackling has largely disappeared from modern kitchens. Chitterlings or chitlins were the sole food that tested both patience and pride. They came from the parts no one else wanted, the hog intestines that had to be scrubbed, boiled, and seasoned with care to become something worth serving. The cleaning took hours, sometimes a full day, and only those with strong hearts and stronger stomachs stayed the course. But once the pot began to simmer, the air filled with the unmistakable smell of heritage, raw, real, and unashamed. Chitlins were more than a meal. They were a connection to ancestors who made beauty out of burden. Seasoned with vinegar, pepper, and love, they became soft, savory ribbons of history. Every plate told a story of survival and pride, of people who refused to waste what life gave them. Around holidays, families gathered to prepare them together, laughing, talking, remembering. It wasn't fancy food, it was freedom food, built from endurance and ingenuity. To eat chitlins was to honor struggle and triumph in the same bite, proof that dignity could be slow-cooked into something unforgettable. Sorghum custard pudding was the taste of warmth on cold nights, made with simple ingredients and endless patience. Milk, eggs, and sorghum syrup came together in one heavy dish, stirred slowly over fire until they thickened into velvet. The flavor was sweet, earthy, and rich with comfort. It was the dessert of those who worked with what they had. No sugar, no fine flour, just what nature offered and hands could make. Served warm, it soothed empty stomachs and weary spirits alike. The pudding glowed like amber in the lamplight, reminding families that care and time could make anything beautiful. It wasn't about extravagance. It was about balance, of hunger and hope, of bitterness and sweetness. Long before desserts were written down, this one was felt in the heart and remembered by taste. Sorghum custard pudding was love made visible, stirred slow enough to last. Apple peel jelly was the sweetness born from thrift, a small miracle simmered from scraps. Black mothers in the 1940s believed nothing edible should ever go to waste. Every apple peel, every core, every leftover slice found a second life in a pot of boiling sugar water. The peels released their color and flavor, turning the liquid golden and fragrant. With a squeeze of lemon and patience, it thickened into jelly, smooth, clear, and shining like captured sunlight. Spread over biscuits or cornbread, it tasted faintly tart, faintly smoky, and entirely like home. It was resourcefulness turned into delight, proof that even the humblest remnants could be beautiful again. Making jelly was an act of care, a quiet resistance against scarcity. It filled jars and shelves, ready for winter mornings when sweetness was rare. The process itself was slow and tender, stirring, tasting, and waiting. It was work done with love, and love never hurried. Apple peel jelly was memory in a jar, the taste of fall days, warm kitchens, and steady hands making something precious out of what others might have thrown away. Corncob jelly was one of those miracles that made people smile at their own cleverness. When the corn was shucked and the cobs left behind, no one dared to throw them out. Those bare cobs went into a big pot of water, boiled until the water turned golden and sweet-smelling. Sugar and a little lemon juice got added next, then everything was strained until the liquid gleamed like honey. The result was a jelly that tasted faintly of corn, syrupy and light, the perfect spread for biscuits or toast. People used it when fruit was scarce, and it carried a quiet pride that came from turning scraps into sweetness. Grandparents remembered it from their childhood, when waste was not an option and imagination ruled the kitchen. Corncob jelly was proof that flavor could be coaxed out of what others might ignore. It was soft, shining, and made with patience. Those who tasted it never forgot that feeling of abundance born from scarcity. Each spoonful told the story of hands that worked hard, saved everything, and still found time to make something beautiful. Pink-eyed pea cakes offered a crisp, hearty meal with almost no effort, transforming yesterday's peas into golden patties in minutes. Cooked peas were mashed with a handful of cornmeal and a pinch of salt, then shaped into small cakes that hit hot oil with a satisfying hiss. The outside browned quickly into a crunchy crust while the inside stayed soft and earthy, full of quiet richness. Served plain with a dash of hot sauce or alongside greens, these cakes filled plates and bellies without draining precious supplies. Families praised the recipe for its speed and thrift, turning a modest pot of beans into something that felt like a feast. Even children enjoyed the crisp edges and gentle flavor, proof that necessity could create its own kind of delicacy. Black-eyed pea cakes captured the essence of survival cooking: fast, frugal, and unexpectedly delicious. A reminder that with a little creativity, even the simplest leftovers could shine. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil. A dash of salt and you were good to go at basically no cost. Rice and egg gravy made the poor man feel rich and the weary feel full again. Eggs were beaten into hot milk and drippings, thickened slowly over a wood stove until the mixture turned smooth, glossy, and golden as dawn. The smell drifted through small homes, wrapping everyone in the comfort of something familiar and kind. There was no meat in it, but somehow it carried the depth and warmth of a feast, the buttery flavor coating every spoonful like quiet reassurance. Each bite felt heavier than it should have, not from the ingredients, but from the love that went into making it. The rice soaked up the gravy, turning plain grains into a meal that could fill a house with gratitude. It was passed around in one bowl, steaming and steady, feeding hands that worked hard and hearts that needed hope. Rice and egg gravy was more than thrift. It was proof that even in the leanest times, creativity turned scarcity into satisfaction. It taught that survival could taste gentle, that a humble kitchen could hold abundance without excess. Every spoonful carried the story of endurance and care, a reminder that simple food could still taste like grace. Sweet potato coffee was a creative substitute born from necessity when real coffee was too expensive or unavailable. Sweet potatoes were sliced, roasted until dark, then ground into a coarse powder and brewed like traditional coffee. The drink was earthy, slightly sweet, and comforting, offering warmth in the morning even if it lacked caffeine. African American families turned to it during hard times, stretching resources while still enjoying the ritual of a morning cup. It showed resilience, proving that even when luxuries were out of reach, tradition could still be honored. Children often drank sweet potato coffee alongside adults, since it was gentle and less bitter. For many, it carried the familiar smell of roasting in the kitchen, a scent tied to family and survival. Forgotten today, it once held great meaning, representing both frugality and creativity. Sweet potato coffee was never about indulgence but about keeping dignity and routine alive in the face of scarcity. Fish head soup was one of those dishes that proved African American cooks could turn what others discarded into something nourishing and delicious. Fishmongers often tossed the heads aside, but frugal families took them home and simmered them with okra, onions, and tomatoes until a rich broth emerged. The heads released flavor into the pot, making the soup taste of the sea even though it cost almost nothing. The okra thickened the broth and added substance, turning the dish into something that could feed many bowls with little expense. Families served it with rice or cornbread, making the meal filling enough to count as supper. While some might have looked down on eating fish heads, those who grew up on the dish remembered it as both comfort and ingenuity. Fish head soup was a reminder that survival depended on seeing value where others saw waste and turning scraps into sustenance. Cushaw squash pie was a forgotten dessert that came before pumpkin pies became the national favorite. The green-striped Cushaw squash was plentiful, sweet, and more reliable than pumpkin in certain regions, making it the natural choice for baking. Cooks roasted the flesh, mashed it smooth, and blended it with eggs, milk, sugar, and spices to create a custard-like filling poured into simple crusts. The result was a golden pie enjoyed at holidays and gatherings, often celebrated for its thrift and flavor. Its taste was gentler than pumpkin, but still spiced and warm, perfect for celebrations when resources were limited. The Cushaw stored well through the winter, so it provided sweetness long after harvest. Over time, canned pumpkin overtook it, pushing Cushaw pie from the spotlight. Yet it once held an important place on family tables, carrying memory, pride, and resourcefulness. Remembering it restores a forgotten piece of African American kitchen heritage. Turkey necks and rice were a dish of thrift and patience, one that turned what many considered scraps into a flavorful meal. Turkey necks were simmered slowly with onions, celery, and spices, creating a broth that was rich and savory. The tender meat was pulled from the bones and served over rice, which absorbed every drop of flavor. Families loved it because it was affordable, filling, and nourishing, a way to stretch small amounts of meat into enough food for everyone. It was especially common around holidays, when leftover turkey parts were put to good use instead of being discarded. Children often remembered the comforting taste, while adults saw it as a dish of necessity turned into something satisfying. Though it has nearly vanished today, turkey necks and rice once represented ingenuity, survival, and the ability to turn little into plenty. It was food that carried both flavor and memory, proof of kitchens where nothing went to waste.
Number 25, Bene wafers. The word Bene comes from the Wolof and Mandinka languages of West Africa, where sesame seeds carried a reputation for good luck. Enslaved Africans brought them to the Carolina Lowcountry in the 17th century, tucked into their hair and clothing. Charleston cooks pressed them into thin, crisp wafers sweetened with brown sugar and butter, baked until the edges curled. The flavor sat between a cookie and a cracker, nutty and warm, with a faint bitterness that no amount of sugar could erase. Bene wafers were standard at Charleston tea tables and church gatherings through the 1950s. By the 1980s, commercial cookie companies had crowded them off grocery shelves. A handful of low-country bakeries still make them today, but most people under 50 have never tasted one. Number 14, hog maw and onions. The Mississippi Delta, late autumn 1936. A grandmother in a one-room cabin on a cotton plantation between Greenville and Cleveland turned a hog's stomach inside out under cold well water and scrubbed it for an hour with cornmeal and a stiff brush. The hog had been killed 3 days earlier. The hams were curing in the smokehouse. The chitterlings were soaking in salt water on the back porch. She rubbed the maw with salt and red pepper, stuffed it loosely with chopped pork shoulder, day-old cornbread, and 3 yellow onions from the root cellar. She sewed the opening shut with cotton thread from her sewing basket. The whole thing went into a deep iron pot covered with cold water and simmered over a low fire from before sunrise until the smell reached the dirt road where her husband walked home from the field at dusk. She did not measure time by a clock. She measured it by the length of the shadows. When the maw was tender enough to slice with the side of a fork, she cut it into thick coins and laid them beside a heap of greens cooked in the same broth. The dish was not pretty. The part that surprised me was finding it on a 1934 USDA survey form. The inspector who came through that county counted hog maw separately because it appeared in 9 out of 10 black households he visited that fall. He did not ask why, he did not ask how. He wrote the numbers down and moved on. Her granddaughter, now 81, still sews the maw shut with cotton thread the same way. She uses a stainless steel pot now. The cornmeal comes from a paper bag at the Piggly Wiggly. The dish tastes the same. The cabin is gone. The plantation is a soybean field. The recipe is still in her hands. Number 23, hominy grits with red-eye gravy. The grits were stone ground at a small mill near Frogmore in 1955, coarse enough you could see each broken kernel. They cooked low for 45 minutes, finished with butter and salt. The gravy was the secret. A slice of country ham went into a hot skillet. The fat rendered, the meat browned, and the cook poured a small cup of black coffee straight into the pan like a dare. The drippings lifted, the coffee reduced, and what was left was a thin, dark sauce poured over the grits and ham. The contrast between the soft cream of the grits and the sharp brown coffee was the whole point. A retired oysterman on Edisto could eat the same breakfast every morning for 40 years. He didn't complain once.
Molasses biscuits were one of those breakfasts that felt both humble and rich, depending entirely on the memory you brought to the table. The biscuits themselves were simple, mixed from flour, fat, and whatever milk or water could be spared, but it was the molasses brushed over the top that made them special. The dark sweetness soaked into the warm bread, giving each bite a deep flavor that felt like comfort stretching back generations. Grandparents baked these because molasses was cheap, shelf-stable, and full of the kind of sweetness that made children smile even when times were tight. The smell alone could bring the whole household into the kitchen, filling the air with something warm and grounding. Some families served them with butter, letting it melt into every crack, while others ate them plain, enjoying the caramel-like richness all on its own. These biscuits were not fancy, but they tasted like care, like effort, like mornings where love was baked into every crumb. They were the kind of breakfast that lingered in your memory long after the plate was empty, reminding you of kitchens where nothing was wasted and everything was shared. Kidney stew was organ meat cooking at its richest, made by slowly braising pork or beef kidneys until tender and flavorful. Black mothers soaked the kidneys in milk or vinegar to remove any strong flavors, then sliced them and cooked them slowly with onions and gravy. The resulting stew was dark, savory, and intensely meaty, providing iron and protein that growing families needed. The kidneys had a unique texture, tender but slightly firm, and a flavor that was rich and mineral. Served over rice or with bread, kidney stew was filling and economical. In the 1920s, organ meats were common because they cost less than muscle meat but provided equal nutrition. Mothers knew that kidneys, properly prepared, were delicious rather than desperate food. The soaking process removed any unpleasant flavors, and slow cooking made them tender. Children who grew up eating kidney stew didn't find it strange. It was simply dinner. The dish represented nose-to-tail eating before it became a culinary trend. Kidney stew has largely disappeared as organ meats fell out of favor, but it once provided essential nourishment to Black families. Hoppin' John was more than food. It was a wish whispered into every new year and a memory of old fields and family prayers. Made from black-eyed peas, rice, and a scrap of salted pork, it carried a meaning far greater than its humble parts. Each bowl symbolized luck, wealth, and resilience, a quiet hope for better days ahead. Born on plantations where ingredients were scarce, Hoppin' John turned survival into tradition. The peas represented coins, the rice abundance, and the pork, the flavor of prosperity. It became a holiday staple across generations, cooked in cast-iron pots and served with greens on the side. The slow simmer filled homes with comfort, while the taste spoke of endurance. People didn't just eat Hoppin' John, they believed in it. It was a way to honor ancestors who worked the land and still found joy in sharing a simple meal. Every spoonful connected past to present, hardship to hope. In the rhythm of the South, Hoppin' John remains a dish that keeps faith alive, proving that luck can be cooked, shared, and passed down like love itself. Cornmeal pound cake was a thrifty twist on a classic, made by those who refused to let poverty rob them of pleasure. When fine white flour was too costly, cooks reached for cornmeal, the golden grain that had carried generations through hunger. The cake came out dense, hearty, and rich, its grainy texture softened by eggs, butter, and sweet milk when available. It baked slow, filling cabins and cottages with a buttery, nutty warmth that made the simplest home feel like a place of celebration. This was the kind of dessert that came from instinct rather than instruction, measured by memory instead of spoons. Each slice told a story of adaptation, of turning necessity into comfort. The cornmeal gave it grit, but also character, a reminder that sweetness could come from the humblest roots. For many, this was the real taste of home, simple, honest, and strong enough to last. Fried salt pork and onions was the breakfast of women who rose before the sun. When bacon was too expensive, this was its sharper cousin, brined, sliced thin, and fried until it sang. The pork hit the pan with a hiss, the onions following close behind, caramelizing in the salt and fat until both turned deep and golden. The smell filled the air, strong enough to wake a house. Served with cornbread or grits, it was fuel for a day that would not wait. It was poor man's food, but no one sitting at the table thought of it that way. Every bite tasted like work made worthwhile. Black mothers in the 1940s cooked from instinct, stretching scraps into something that fed more than hunger. The leftover grease seasoned tomorrow's greens, a quiet thread connecting meals across time. That skillet was their song, their rhythm of care. Fried salt pork and onions was not luxury, but it was abundance of another kind, the kind made from effort, love, and survival that crackled in every pan. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Sorghum oat cakes provided hearty energy for long days while demanding barely any time to prepare. Rolled oats were quickly cooked in hot water until soft, then mixed with a generous pour of sorghum syrup for natural sweetness. The warm mixture was pressed into small cakes and lightly browned in a hot skillet, forming a crisp exterior while staying tender inside. Their nutty aroma and gentle sweetness made them a favorite for both breakfast and late-night snacks, offering quick nourishment without expensive ingredients. Families appreciated how the oats filled stomachs, and the sorghum added a rich, earthy flavor that refined sugar could not match. In households where every penny mattered, these cakes proved that a simple pantry could still produce something special in minutes. They traveled well too, wrapped in cloth for field work or school lunches, ensuring no one went hungry between meals. Sorghum oat cakes embodied the spirit of making do with what you had, transforming basic staples into a warm, sustaining dish that tasted far richer than its cost. When life hands you a cow but almost nothing else, You cook the cow's brains. Fried cow brains, or calf's brains, if you want to sound a bit more gourmet, was a Dust Bowl specialty not because people wanted to eat it, but because they had to. They were not fastidious in the past. When you had to fight for your life, you ate everything that was on the animal. Now I know that fried cow brains may sound like something that shouldn't even be considered food, let alone something that might be considered delicious. For this dish, brains were washed in water or milk, dredged in flour, and fried until brown and crispy. Consider them as the first-generation chicken nuggets, if chicken nuggets had a soft core and came with a helping of angst. The flavor? It was mild, almost buttery, and that was the reason why nobody fled from the dish when somebody served it. Cow brains fried were dense in nutrients, especially protein, and thus a good meal during famine. While nowadays people might shudder at the thought of consuming brains, in the past, it was simply Tuesday's supper. And hey, if you put some gravy on top, it might just seem like you're eating gourmet food. Fried rice cakes with molasses drizzle were the small joy at the end of a long week. Leftover rice, pressed into rounds and fried golden in sizzling fat, turned crisp outside and soft inside like pancakes for the patient. Once stacked, they were drizzled with molasses, the dark syrup pooling between edges and soaking through the cracks. For children, it was the sweetest thing they knew, eaten with fingers sticky and laughter loud. Grown folks called it supper when cupboards ran empty, proof that a treat could still fill a stomach. The crackle of frying rice sounded like home, simple, rhythmic, reassuring. It was the sound of making something out of nothing and smiling through it anyway. Fried rice cakes with molasses drizzle turned leftovers into love and hardship into a kind of celebration. They were proof that sweetness was never out of reach as long as imagination stayed alive. Lemony grit cakes were a clever way to make sure nothing went to waste. Leftover grits, once cooled, were shaped into patties and fried in fat until crisp on the outside and soft within. They were sometimes topped with syrup, gravy, or bits of meat, making them adaptable to whatever was available. African American families valued grit cakes because they stretched food further, creating another meal from yesterday's pot. They were quick to prepare and filling, a simple breakfast or side dish that carried both thrift and comfort. Children liked the crispy edges, while adults appreciated the versatility. Grit cakes reflected the creativity of survival cooking, proving that even scraps could be turned into something delicious. They carried the memory of hearth kitchens where nothing was discarded. Forgotten today, grit cakes were once essential, reminding families that food had to be respected and used wisely. They remain a quiet testament to resourcefulness. Fried rabbit was a dish born from necessity because hunting often became the only way to put meat on the table when money was scarce. Rabbits were abundant in rural areas, and African American families would skin and clean them before frying in seasoned flour until the meat was crisp on the outside and tender inside. The flavor was mild, often compared to chicken, and the dish quickly became a favorite whenever game was available. It was usually served with potatoes or greens, making it feel like a proper dinner even though it cost nothing but time and skill to hunt. For many children, eating fried rabbit was both a treat and a lesson in how their families survived without relying on expensive store-bought meats. The act of turning wild game into Sunday dinner was part of a larger culture of resilience, teaching generations that food could be found and created outside the market. Fried rabbit symbolized thrift, tradition, and connection to the land, and for those who remember it, the memory is tied to both hardship and the pride of self-sufficiency. Chitlin loaf was born out of necessity, a recipe designed to make the most of pig intestines, which were one of the few cuts left to enslaved communities after butchering. Chitterlings were thoroughly cleaned, boiled, chopped, and pressed into a loaf pan until they set firm enough to slice. When eaten cold, it resembled luncheon meat, but when fried, it took on a crisp, savory flavor that gave strength to people working long hours. It stretched resources in a way that turned scraps into something resembling a complete dish. The loaf could be seasoned with onion, pepper, and whatever herbs were on hand, making each version unique to the family that prepared it. For many households, chitlin loaf became a tradition that reached beyond slavery and into later generations who still valued the thrift and ingenuity it represented. Although it faded from mainstream tables, it left a mark as an example of transforming what others discarded into nourishment. The loaf told a story of resilience and pride, turning humble offal into a remembered part of African American food history that shaped diets across the South. Stewed oxtails with rice was once considered a treasure in African American kitchens, proof that patience could turn tough cuts into tender, flavorful meals. Oxtails were browned, then simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and rich broth until the meat nearly fell off the bone. The long cooking released deep flavors that soaked into the gravy, poured generously over fluffy rice. It was filling, nourishing, and comforting, stretching one pot into enough servings for the whole family. Children often fought over who got the largest piece, while adults savored the richness of a dish that was both humble and luxurious. Oxtails were affordable once, which made the recipe accessible to working families. Over the years, the cut became expensive, and the dish slowly disappeared from daily tables. Yet in its heyday, stewed oxtails with rice carried history, resourcefulness, and pride, a reminder that good food came not from expense, but from skill, time, and love.
Number 22, callus, rice fritters, deep fried in lard until the outside crackled and the inside stayed soft and steaming. West African women had been making nearly identical rice cakes for centuries. In the Low Country, free and enslaved black women sold callus on the streets in the early morning hours, calling out their wares to announce them. The fritters cost a penny or two. They were breakfast food, street food, survival food. The tradition was strongest in the 1700s and 1800s and faded after the Civil War as street vending laws tightened and the women who carried the tradition were pushed off the sidewalks. New Orleans kept its version alive longer than Charleston did, but in both cities, the women who sold them at dawn have been largely written out of the story. Number 23, tomato gravy on rice. A widow in Charleston spooned rendered bacon fat into a heavy iron skillet, sprinkled in a tablespoon of flour, stirred until it browned, then poured in a quart of canned tomatoes she had put up the August before. The gravy turned the color of brick. She ladled it over white rice she had cooked in the same kettle her grandmother had carried out of slavery in 1865. Tomato gravy was Tuesday food. It was Thursday food. It was everyday but Sunday food. The tomatoes came from a half-acre patch behind the house. The bacon fat came from a jar that never emptied because she never let it. Tomato gravy on rice fed her 4 children straight through the Depression. If your people came up in the Low Country, you know the way that gravy stains a white plate red. None of them went to bed wondering. Number 18, fish stew with whiting. The whiting was small, white-fleshed, and almost free at the dock if you came at the end of the run. A man on Hilton Head in 1955 could buy a paper bag full for 50 cents. The fish were headed and cleaned, then laid into a pot with sliced onion, diced potato, a piece of salt pork, and water to cover. Some cooks added a fresh tomato in summer, some didn't. It cooked 25 minutes, no longer, until the potato was tender and the fish broke apart in soft white flakes like paper in water. Salt and black pepper at the end, a piece of cornbread on the side. The broth was thin and clean and tasted of the marsh. There was no cream, no roux. This wasn't New England chowder. This was a Sea Island stew built to feed 8 people from one cheap fish every Friday in houses from Beaufort to Brunswick.
Cornbread and buttermilk cups were the kind of breakfast that felt both rustic and comforting, the sort of meal grandparents made without measuring or fuss because they had been doing it their whole lives. Leftover cornbread never went to waste, not when it could be crumbled into a bowl and soaked in cold buttermilk until the pieces softened but kept just enough texture to make each bite interesting. The tang of the buttermilk balanced the slight sweetness of the cornbread, creating a flavor that felt simple yet deeply satisfying. Some families added a spoonful of sugar, others preferred it plain, but either way, it tasted like something honest and nourishing. It was a breakfast built for long days, a quick way to fill stomachs without spending money or time. Children who grew up on it remember the chilly shock of the buttermilk, the softness of the crumbs, and the quiet pleasure of eating something that required no stove at all. It tasted like tradition handed down through memory rather than recipes, a meal tied to rural kitchens, hardworking families, and morning routines shaped by practicality. Even today, people who try it for the first time often describe it as unexpectedly comforting, like discovering a forgotten piece of their own history. Cornbread and buttermilk cups might seem humble, but in the hands of grandparents, they became something far richer than the ingredients suggested. Ash cake was once the bread of survival, baked directly in the hot ashes of wood-burning stoves when families had nothing else. Black mothers would mix cornmeal with water and salt, shape it into thick patties, and nestle them into the glowing coals. The cakes baked slowly, developing a dark, ash-covered crust that was brushed away to reveal tender, slightly smoky bread inside. The texture was dense and gritty, the flavor earthy and pure, nothing but corn and fire. Children ate ash cakes with molasses or pot liquor, soaking up whatever liquid was available. In rural Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, ash cake appeared when wheat flour was impossible to afford. Mothers made them because they required no pans, no grease, and no oven, just cornmeal and heat. Though forgotten today, ash cake once stood as proof that survival required nothing more than fire, meal, and determination. Pan-fried gizzards were the kind of meal that proved patience was as important as any spice. Tough and chewy at first, these scraps of poultry were transformed through slow cleaning, seasoning, and frying into golden bites of pride. A bowl of seasoned flour, a splash of buttermilk, and a hot cast-iron skillet were all it took to turn what most people ignored into something worth gathering for. The gizzards hissed in oil until they were crisp on the outside and tender within, each one carrying the smoky taste of hard work and heart. Families would pile them high on paper towels, watching the steam rise like a promise that dinner was ready. Every batch felt earned, every crunch a reminder that flavor came from care, not wealth. Children gnawed at the edges, soaking the last bits in hot sauce, while elders nodded in approval. Pan-fried gizzards were food that spoke of resourcefulness, a celebration of making something special from nothing. They filled kitchens with the sound of sizzling survival, the scent of seasoning that lingered long after the plates were empty. In every bite was proof that thrift could taste like triumph. Cornbread trifle was the kind of dessert that proved creativity could make even leftovers feel like a feast. When cornbread went stale, it wasn't thrown away. It was reborn. Crumbled into bowls, soaked with sweet milk or molasses, and layered with bits of fruit if available, it became a pudding-like treat that filled bellies and hearts alike. The texture was soft and creamy, rich without requiring riches. It was food for the end of the week, when cupboards were bare but family still gathered to share what was left. Each spoonful carried both sweetness and survival, the magic of making something out of nothing. Cornbread trifle was not a luxury. It was an act of imagination. It turned scarcity into flavor and the ordinary into comfort. Even now, its story lingers, a reminder that sometimes the best recipes are born from the need to keep going. Egg and onion gravy over rice was a masterclass in stretching little into plenty. One egg, a handful of onions, and a spoon of flour could become dinner for a family. The onions fried until sweet, the egg whisked in, thickening the mixture into a silky golden gravy. Poured over warm rice, it became rich, comforting, and deeply familiar. It was not fancy, but it filled every corner of hunger. In the 1940s, eggs were precious, but Black mothers knew how to make one work like 10. Each spoonful carried the flavor of thrift turned to art. It was seasoned with black pepper, salt, and a touch of love that no spice could replace. The dish was a reminder that a full stomach did not require plenty, only patience and care. Egg and onion gravy was proof that home-cooked ingenuity could taste like abundance. Lard cakes were the sweetheart of hard times, the kind of dessert that brought back joy when butter was a dream. Made from flour, sugar, and a scoop of lard saved from breakfast, they baked up soft and fragrant. The smell filled the house, buttery without butter, rich without cream. People called them poverty cakes, but they tasted like victory. The lard kept them moist for days, and a touch of spice or molasses made them taste like something from a bakery. Children licked the crumbs from their fingers, not caring that it came from the same jar used for frying eggs. Every family had their own version, some with raisins, some with cinnamon, each one proud and personal. Lard cakes were a reminder that sweetness was not about luxury. It was about invention. They were proof that love could rise from scarcity, baked golden in worn pans and shared without shame. In kitchens filled with laughter and thrift, lard cakes turned necessity into delight. Collard green wraps turned sturdy garden leaves into quick, portable bundles of nourishment. Fresh collards were blanched briefly in boiling water until pliable, then filled with seasoned beans, leftover rice, or even small bits of smoked meat. Rolled tightly, the wraps held together on their own, needing no elaborate binding or long cooking time. A splash of vinegar or a drizzle of hot sauce added brightness, while the gentle bitterness of the greens balanced the hearty fillings. These wraps were easy to assemble and ready to eat almost as soon as they were rolled, making them ideal for fieldwork lunches or busy mornings. Families appreciated how this dish stretched garden harvests and transformed simple ingredients into something satisfying and portable. Collard green wraps celebrated the creativity of cooks who made wholesome, flavorful meals out of what was at hand, proving that healthy, filling food could be prepared in a flash when necessity demanded quick solutions without sacrificing taste or nutrition. Chicken a la king and puff pastry was another little nugget of French culture and cuisine that served us pretty well. So the idea here this time was to stuff creamy chicken and mushrooms into one single pastry, and there would be lots of these individual pastries, each stuffed to the brim. By now, we're talking about somewhere along the 70s. America's always been a big fan of cream. There's really no denying that, but I would say that we've warmed up to mushrooms a lot more than we used to. I don't think they were not popular, but they weren't exactly a standout ingredient that would be making anyone's top 10 or top 5 either. Americans were changing their palates regarding mushrooms thanks to two things, though. One, they had built up a fondness for it thanks to how many Americans, especially ones living on the edges of urban hubs, relied on foraging wild mushrooms. Two, things like cream soups, such as cream of mushroom soups, were already making the pairing of cream and mushrooms popular. This take on puff pastry wasn't exactly a long shot, since the stage was pretty much mostly set. However, I think most people have opted for things like sandwiches and ordering takeout at lunch now, or just getting a coffee. Work culture's really changed, and having a full-fledged meal during your 15-minute break isn't the most appealing option to a lot of people nowadays. Potato peel pie came from kitchens that refused to let hunger win. Every saved peel was mashed with milk, onion, salt, and flour to make a filling that turned creamy once baked inside a crisp crust of leftover dough. It was a dish born from hands that knew how to stretch every harvest until there was nothing left to save. The smell of roasting potatoes drifted through small homes and fields, earthy and rich, the scent of supper and survival. No one thought it was strange to eat what others might throw away. They just called it dinner and thanked God for it. Potato peel pie was not fancy, but it held the taste of warmth and care in every bite. The browned edges crackled, the inside stayed soft, and the pie cooled slow on the windowsill like something precious. It was the very picture of Southern thrift, clever, kind, and stubborn in all the right ways. People did not just eat to live, they ate to remember who they were. Potato peel pie was comfort baked right into a crust, proof that love always found a way to feed a family. Goober pea stew was a dish with roots tracing directly back to West Africa, where peanuts were long a staple. In African American kitchens, peanuts, called goober peas, were simmered with vegetables, spices, and sometimes scraps of meat to create a thick, hearty stew. It was affordable, nourishing, and rich in protein, perfect for families making the most of limited supplies. The stew's flavor carried warmth and earthiness, with peanuts giving body and depth to simple ingredients. For enslaved people, it was a way to preserve traditions under impossible circumstances, blending African flavors with what was available in the Americas. Later generations continued cooking goober pea stew, especially in rural southern communities, where it was shared at gatherings and remembered as a food of both struggle and comfort. It spoke of cultural memory, resilience, and adaptation, proof that African roots remained strong across oceans and generations. Forgotten by many, it once symbolized the creativity of making abundance from scarcity. Pickled okra was one of the clever ways African American families preserved vegetables so they would last through seasons when fresh produce was scarce. Okra, with its tender pods, was grown in many home gardens and often produced more than families could eat at once. By pickling it in jars with vinegar, garlic, and spices, moms ensured there was something bright and tangy to add to plates months later. Pickled okra was crunchy, flavorful, and worked well alongside heavy dishes like beans, stews, and meats, where its acidity cut through richness. It became a staple at gatherings because it offered a pop of color and zest that livened up otherwise plain meals. Beyond taste, it was a strategy of survival, because preserving food was the only way to guarantee something green in the winter months. The jars lined on pantry shelves told a story of foresight and resilience. Pickled okra stood as proof that African American families made use of everything they grew, turning gardens into sources of year-round nourishment that carried both flavor and memory. Souse, or pickled pork parts, was one of the thriftiest dishes to come from African American kitchens, making use of pig's feet, ears, and snouts. These cuts were cleaned, boiled, and then preserved in vinegar, onions, and spices until they took on a tangy flavor. Once cooled, the meat set into a gelatin-like texture that could be sliced and eaten cold. It was high in protein, cheap to prepare, and kept well, which made it a practical food for households with limited access to refrigeration. Souse was eaten with bread, crackers, or on its own, giving families a way to stretch meager supplies into days of meals. It was a dish of necessity but also of ingenuity, turning unwanted parts into something flavorful and sustaining. For many, it became a cultural staple remembered for its bold taste and practicality. Though it has slipped from most tables today, souse reflects the resilience of African American cooking traditions that turned thrift into heritage. Red rice was a Carolina Lowcountry staple, a dish with deep African roots that made its way into African American kitchens as both comfort food and tradition. Rice was cooked with tomatoes, onions, peppers, and spices until each grain absorbed the bright, tangy flavor. Sometimes sausage or bacon was added, but the dish stood strong on its own as a filling side or main course. It was a dish of community, appearing at gatherings, church suppers, and family dinners, always bringing with it a sense of connection to heritage. Red rice carried the legacy of West African cooking traditions, where rice and tomatoes were long intertwined. Its vibrant color made it stand out on the table, but it was its flavor and cultural meaning that made it beloved. Over time, it has faded from everyday cooking, overshadowed by faster and more modern dishes. But red rice remains an important symbol of the ties between food and history, reminding families that heritage could be tasted, shared, and preserved with every forkful. It was both sustenance and story, tied together in a single pot of rice.
Number 14, rice bread. This is where the theft gets personal. Carolina gold rice was the most valuable crop in the colonial Lowcountry, and the people who grew it, harvested it, and processed it were enslaved Africans from the rice-growing regions of West Africa. They brought not just labor, but knowledge, how to build tidal irrigation systems, how to thresh and winnow by hand, how to judge when a grain was ready, and they brought the knowledge of how to cook with rice in ways that went far beyond boiling it. Rice bread was one of those ways. Gullah bakers ground raw rice into a fine flour, mixed it with water and a little wheat flour, and baked it into a dense, slightly sweet loaf that held together better than cornbread and lasted longer. The texture was unlike anything in the European baking tradition. chewy, moist, with a sweetness that came from the rice itself, not from sugar. Rice bread was a plantation staple in both the big house and the slave quarters, though the quality differed sharply. The enslaved version used broken rice, the grains that cracked during processing and could not be sold. The big house version used whole polished grains. Same bread, different rice, different tables. When commercial wheat flour became cheap after the Civil War, rice bread disappeared almost overnight. Wheat was easier, more forgiving, and produced a lighter loaf. Nobody mourned the loss except the people who had made it, and nobody was asking them. A few Charleston bakeries have revived rice flour baking today, but the original Gullah recipe, made with hand-pounded rice and baked in a wood-fired oven, exists only in the memories of the oldest Sea Island families. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The Low Country food system was a theft machine. Enslaved Africans brought the seeds, the knowledge, the techniques, and the labor. What they received in return was a measured portion of what they produced, handed out by someone who owned them. This was not unskilled labor supervised by clever planters. This was skilled agriculture directed by experts who happened to be in chains. The dishes on this list are what those experts created with whatever was left after the harvest was sold and the pantry was locked. They turned bene seeds into soup, broken rice into bread, and trash fish into breakfast. The word for that is not survival. The word is genius. Charleston never said it out loud until historians forced the conversation. Number 22, fatback gravy on grits. Before sunrise in a clapboard house outside Greenville, Mississippi, the grandmother fried 3 strips of fatback until the meat curled like a brown leaf and the kitchen filled with smoke. She left the rendered fat in the pan, whisked in flour, then poured in evaporated milk thinned with water. The gravy went pale gold and sticky. Stone ground grits had been simmering on the back burner since 4 in the morning. She spooned the gravy over the grits in chipped enamel bowls and set them on the table without a word. Her grandchildren ate standing up because the table only sat 4. Fatback gravy on grits was the breakfast that walked you to the cotton scales. It was the breakfast that walked you to the schoolhouse 3 miles down a dirt road. It was the breakfast that did not let you fall. Number 25, Dofusky deviled crab. The blue crabs came up out of the creek at dawn. Sally Ann Robinson learned to pick one clean before she could read. The meat went into a porcelain bowl with crushed saltines, 1 beaten egg, a pinch of dry mustard, and a hard shake of black pepper. The mixture went back into the clean shell of the crab itself, like a small boat carrying its own cargo. That was the plate, that was the serving dish. Each shell went under the broiler until the top blistered. A family of 9 could eat off 12 crabs and a sleeve of crackers. The shells were rinsed and stored on a shelf for next time. On Dofusky in 1962, the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute boat ride away. The crab paid for itself.
Fried cornmeal mush with syrup was one of those breakfasts that quietly carried families through the hardest decades, long before boxed cereal took over the mornings. A pot of mush would be cooked and thickened the night before because nothing could go to waste, and cornmeal was one of the cheapest staples you could rely on. By sunrise, it would be firm enough to slice, each piece hitting the skillet with that gentle hiss that meant breakfast was truly beginning. The outside browned until crisp, while the inside stayed soft, warm, and steady, making every bite feel both hearty and familiar. When syrup was poured over those golden slices, it turned the humble dish into something sweet and comforting, the kind of sweetness that did not need to be fancy to feel special. Grandparents made this because it filled bellies, stretched ingredients, and tasted like something far richer than it really was. Children did not think about thrift or struggle, they just knew it tasted like love served on a plate. Fried mush might look simple today, but its roots run deep in memory, in resilience, in the way older generations held families together one skillet breakfast at a time. Even now, one bite brings back chilly mornings, warm kitchens, and the soft scrape of a metal spatula flipping a slice just right. Rabbit haslet was thrifty cooking at its finest, using the organ meats from wild rabbits to create rich, savory gravy. Black mothers cleaned rabbit livers, hearts, and kidneys carefully, then chopped them finely and cooked them slowly with onions and seasonings. The organs released their richness into the gravy, creating something deeply flavorful that stretched to feed more people. Served over rice or biscuits, haslet was economical and nourishing, providing iron and protein from parts that might otherwise be discarded. In rural communities during the 1920s, rabbit hunting was common, and mothers knew how to use every part of the animal. The haslet was made immediately after cleaning the rabbit. Children might wrinkle their noses at first, but they learned to appreciate the rich mineral flavor from organ meats. The dish represented complete utilization and respect for the animal. Today, organ meat cooking has largely disappeared, but in the 1920s, Black mothers knew that wasting any part of food was unthinkable. Molasses bread was the sweetness that softened hard weeks. Made from sorghum or cane syrup, it was a dark, sticky loaf that baked up rich and fragrant even when sugar was scarce. A single jar of syrup could stretch through countless loaves, turning thrift into comfort. It came out of the oven glossy and dense, the kind of bread you sliced thin to make it last longer. The taste was deep and earthy, sweet without being showy, a flavor born from the fields where sorghum stalks waved in the sun. On Sundays, families shared it warm with butter or a drizzle of leftover syrup, its smell filling every corner of home. The crust held a quiet crunch, while the inside stayed soft, like memory itself. It was both humble and proud, a loaf that didn't need fancy ingredients to feel like celebration. For people who knew want, molasses bread was a small luxury, a reward for making it through the week. Each slice carried the warmth of family hands and the sweetness of work well done. In every crumb was proof that joy could rise from scarcity and bake into something lasting. Sweet potato tea cakes were soft little miracles that brought a whisper of sweetness to hard days. Made from mashed sweet potatoes, sugar, and flour, they baked up tender and fragrant, somewhere between a cookie and a biscuit. The flavor was deep and earthy, tied to the African roots that first carried sweet potatoes across the ocean. Women baked them for children after long hours in the fields, serving them with tea, molasses, or just a kind word. The dough was often mixed by hand in wooden bowls, shaped without measuring, guided only by touch and memory. Even in times when sugar was scarce, the natural sweetness of the potato carried the recipe through. Each cake was a lesson in resourcefulness and care, a soft, spiced offering that said, "We made it through another day." To eat one was to taste both survival and love, baked gently into every crumb. Ham bone soup with collards was born from necessity and pride. When the main meal ended, the bone stayed behind, waiting to be boiled for tomorrow's broth. Nothing went to waste, not even the scraps clinging to the bone. Collard greens joined the pot, their earthy flavor softening the salt and smoke that rose from the simmering water. Sometimes there were carrots or beans, sometimes just greens and hope. The broth grew darker and richer as it cooked, stretching one meal into 2 or 3. It was not about luxury. It was about care, the kind that came from making something out of almost nothing. In those years, meat was a blessing, and bones carried every bit of their worth. The soup filled bellies, warmed homes, and reminded families that survival could still taste good. When served with cornbread, it felt like a feast. For many, that pot symbolized more than thrift. It was the art of turning hunger into heritage. Pot scrappin' soup was the kind of meal that made use of every last bit that life gave. When the pantry was empty, people turned to what clung to the bottom of the pot. They poured in hot water, scraped up every browned edge and leftover piece of vegetable or meat, and built a new meal from what was left behind. It simmered for hours until the flavors came together, smoky and deep, with hints of salt and spice from earlier meals. No two pots ever tasted the same, and that was the beauty of it. Sometimes it had bits of onion, sometimes beans or bones, always something saved from before. It filled the air with a smell of gratitude, the kind that made even the poorest home feel rich. Children dunked stale cornbread in it, soaking up every drop. Pot scrap and soup reminded families that nothing was ever truly gone, not flavor, not hope, not care. It turned waste into warmth and leftovers into love. The sound of that bubbling pot was a hymn for survival, proof that the end of the week still had something worth waiting for. Molasses cornbread skillet came together in a rush of sweet aroma and sizzling iron, a lifesaver when time and money were short. The batter started with simple cornmeal and a spoonful of baking powder stirred into warm milk. Then dark molasses flowed in to lend a deep, earthy sweetness that turned every bite into comfort. A heavy cast iron pan was heated until nearly smoking, greased with whatever fat was on hand, and the batter poured in with a hiss that filled the room with the promise of quick nourishment. 10 minutes later, the edges pulled from the pan, the center set firm, and the top turned golden brown while the bottom formed a crust that crackled beneath a knife. Families sliced it thick, eating it plain when sugar was scarce or drizzling a little syrup if luck allowed. This skillet bread needed no fancy ingredients or long waiting, only a hot fire and steady hand, making it the kind of meal that fed weary workers before dawn or after a long day in the fields. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Sweet potato coffee cakes were the color of sunrise and the taste of endurance. Made from mashed sweet potatoes, a handful of flour, and a splash of milk, they puffed up in hot skillets like small golden pillows. The scent that rose was warm and earthy, a mix of sweetness and smoke that could fill a house with comfort. Grandmothers flipped them by hand, humming as they cooked, serving them plain or with a drizzle of syrup when luck allowed. They were soft in the middle, crisp at the edges, and heavy enough to quiet hunger for hours. Sweet potato coffee cakes carried the sweetness of what the land gave, and the pride of what hands could make from nearly nothing. They were served with black coffee, the kind brewed strong enough to wake the weary and steady the spirit. Each bite reminded families that simple ingredients could bring more joy than expensive ones ever could. Sweet potato coffee cakes were not dessert and not bread, but something that lived between both, soft with memory and strong with survival. They were the taste of mornings that began with hope, even when cupboards were thin and times were lean. Raccoon may sound unusual to modern ears, but in rural African-American communities, it was a common and practical dish. Hunting was an important way to supplement diets when money or access to meat was limited, and raccoon provided a reliable source of protein. The meat was cleaned carefully, often soaked to reduce its strong flavor, then seasoned and baked slowly until tender. Families would serve it with root vegetables or cornbread, turning what some might see as wild game into a hearty family meal. It was not considered exotic or strange at the time. It was simply another way to make use of what the land provided. Children grew up eating raccoon without second thought, knowing it was part of the rhythm of survival. For many, it carried the taste of the woods, a reminder that food could always be found if you knew where to look. Forgotten now, baked raccoon was once a vital dish that showed ingenuity in the face of scarcity. Pine bark stew was a community dish tied to African-American coastal traditions in North Carolina. Despite its name, there was no bark involved, but instead fish, potatoes, onions, and tomatoes stewed together in huge pots that fed entire gatherings. Families often prepared it outdoors at church events or celebrations, with the smell of simmering fish mingling with smoke from open fires. The stew was hearty, spicy, and communal, designed to be ladled generously into bowls and shared freely. Often made with smaller fish that had little market value, it proved that resourcefulness could turn simple ingredients into abundance. Cornbread usually accompanied it, soaking up the broth and completing the meal. For many, pine bark stew became more than food. It was a memory of neighbors, laughter, and togetherness. It showed how resilience could transform necessity into celebration, weaving community and survival into every steaming bowl of stew. Hog crackling popcorn mix was a rural snack that combined the love of pork with the tradition of corn. Corn kernels were popped in rendered hog fat, giving them a smoky richness that butter could never replicate. To make it even heartier, salty bits of pork cracklings were stirred through the mix, creating a snack that was both crunchy and savory. Families gathered around bowls of it in the evenings, sharing handfuls while telling stories or winding down from long days of work. It was inexpensive, easy to prepare, and used ingredients that most households already had on hand. Cracklings themselves were a byproduct of hog butchering, so they carried no extra cost, making this treat especially appealing. It was food that celebrated thrift, but it was also undeniably enjoyable, filling the house with smells that brought comfort. Hog crackling popcorn mix deserves to be remembered as one of the cleverest country snacks, born of making the most out of every part of the harvest. Collard green egg rolls were a creative twist that appeared in the 1970s, blending traditional flavors with new presentation. Collard greens, seasoned with onion, garlic, and bits of ham, were wrapped in thin wrappers and fried until crisp. The result was a handheld snack that carried the flavor of tradition but looked modern and fun. They often appeared at potlucks, church suppers, and parties, where they stood out among more conventional dishes. Families enjoyed them because they combined comfort with novelty, giving new life to a familiar recipe. Children were more likely to try collard greens when they came in crispy rolls, making them a clever way to introduce vegetables. Though the trend faded, collard green egg rolls represented an era of experimentation in African American cooking when classic recipes were reshaped for a changing world. Today, they are remembered fondly by those who first saw them sizzling on buffet tables, proof that tradition and innovation could meet in one bite.
Number 17, Benny seed soup. Enslaved cooks in the Charleston Low Country ground Benny seeds into a paste, thinned it with broth, and simmered it until it became a rich, nutty, cream-colored soup. The technique was a direct descendant of West African sesame-based stews, where ground seeds provided the fat and protein that meat could not. In the big house, Benny soup was served in porcelain bowls as a first course. In the kitchen, behind the main house, the cook and her children ate what remained in the pot, if anything remained. The soup required nothing expensive: seeds, water, heat. Its richness came from technique, not ingredients. When sesame farming declined in the Low Country after the Civil War, the tradition of cooking with Benny went with it. Number 18, fried bologna with mustard. A grandmother in Tulsa stood at her gas range in 1962 and laid 4 slices of Oscar Mayer bologna into a dry cast iron skillet. She had cut a small X in the center of each slice with a paring knife so they would not curl like a tin lid. The edges browned and crisped within 90 seconds. She slid them between 2 slices of Wonder Bread, spread with French's yellow mustard, and handed the sandwiches to her grandsons before they ran out the door to the bus stop. Fried bologna was Saturday morning food in Greenwood, the black neighborhood of Tulsa that had burned in 1921 and rebuilt itself sandwich by sandwich. The grease in the pan was saved for the pinto beans she would cook on Sunday. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was ever wasted. Number 17, field pea soup with smoked hocks. The pea was the Sea Island red pea, a small dark legume Gula families had been growing in side yard plots for 200 years. A cup of dried peas was rinsed, picked over for stones, and dropped into a pot with the smoked ham hock from the previous winter's hog. Onion, garlic, a sprig of thyme, water. It cooked for 3 hours like a slow clock. The hock fell apart, the peas softened into a thick brown porridge, and the broth turned almost meaty. A bowl with rice and cornbread fed your working man for the whole afternoon. The Sea Island red pea nearly went extinct in the 20th century when commercial farms switched to the cheaper black-eyed pea. Today, it's grown again by a handful of low-country farmers. The grandmothers never stopped saving the seeds. They knew what they had.
Egg and rice bowls were one of those fast, dependable breakfasts grandparents made without thinking, because the ingredients were always there and the result was always good. A pot of rice from last night could be rewarmed with a pat of butter, turning it soft and fragrant again. Then came the egg, fried or scrambled, laid gently over the top like a finishing touch. Only older hands knew how to time perfectly. The yolk soaked into the rice or the scrambled bits mixed through, creating a bowl that tasted warm, mild, and deeply comforting. It was cheap, quick, and endlessly reliable, the kind of breakfast that made mornings feel steady. Families loved it because nothing went to waste, because rice could stretch farther than any box of cereal ever could. Egg and rice bowls tasted like routine, like care, like the kind of quiet morning love that came before the sun was fully up. Neckbone stew was Sunday dinner in many black households, made by simmering pork neck bones until the meat fell tender and the broth turned rich. Black mothers would brown the bones first to develop flavor, then cover them with water and cook slowly with onions, garlic, and whatever vegetables were available. The bones released gelatin and marrow, creating a thick, nourishing broth. The meat, though tough when raw, became soft and pull-apart tender after hours of cooking. Families ate neckbone stew over rice, with bread or straight from bowls, sucking the marrow from bones. In the 1920s, neck bones were among the cheapest cuts available, often given away or sold for pennies. Black mothers transformed these discarded bones into meals that sustained families through the week. The stew improved with time, becoming even richer as it sat. The dish represented alchemy, turning bones into nourishment through patience and knowledge. Today, neck bones remain popular in some communities, but the technique of slow cooking them into rich stew has been lost to many. Sweet potato biscuits were the soft-spoken stars of every humble table. Made from mashed sweet potatoes, flour, and a touch of lard, they carried the sweetness of the earth and the strength of those who planted it. Each biscuit came out of the oven golden, warm, and smelling like home. Sweet potatoes were a gift crop, tough enough to thrive when others failed, and they carried families through hard seasons. These biscuits stretched what little was available into something that felt like luxury. They were eaten for breakfast with syrup or alongside greens and stew at supper. No matter when, they always brought a comfort that money could not buy. The dough was often mixed by hand, shaped on worn counters, and baked in cast iron. The rhythm of making them passed from mother to daughter like a blessing. Sweet potato biscuits were proof that sweetness could come from struggle, that even the humblest harvest could rise high in the oven and on the heart. They fed not just the body but the spirit, turning hardship into hope with every tender bite. Cane syrup taffy pulls were moments of laughter wrapped in sticky sweetness, one of the few times children on plantations could forget the weight of their world. Syrup was boiled in iron pots until bubbling thick, then poured out to cool and pulled by hand into shiny golden ropes. It was hard work, but it was joy disguised as labor. The smell filled the air like music, burnt sugar and smoke mingling with the sound of laughter. Kids competed to stretch the taffy the longest, their hands gloved in butter to keep it from sticking. It was a shared delight in a life built on scarcity, a fleeting sweetness that belonged entirely to them. When the taffy hardened, it gleamed like amber glass, a memory you could taste. These pulls were more than candy. They were moments of freedom, soft and sweet, that stayed long after the sugar was gone. Cornmeal dumplings in stew were a small miracle in a hungry world. Flour was precious, but cornmeal, that humble golden grain, was always close at hand. Mixed with a little fat, salt, and water, It became the heart of a dish that could stretch a pot of broth into days of meals. When dropped into bubbling stew, the dumplings swelled with flavor, soft inside but firm enough to hold together. They carried the taste of comfort, the feeling of fullness, and the quiet triumph of making enough from little. Black mothers in the 1940s understood this kind of alchemy, turning scarcity into satisfaction with skill and faith. The trick was in the timing, knowing when to stir, when to wait, and when to serve. Children gathered at the table, spoons ready, drawn by the smell that meant dinner was nearly done. The first bite was always the best, warm, savory, and steady. Cornmeal dumplings reminded every eater that food did not need wealth to feel rich. They were proof that care and patience could flavor anything. What began as survival became comfort, a tradition born of thrift but remembered for love. Grease gravy rice was what people cooked when they refused to let anything go to waste. When breakfast meats were done frying, the leftover grease became treasure. A spoon of flour went in first, sizzling and popping until it turned golden. Then milk or water got poured in, slow and steady, until it thickened into smooth gravy. That hot gravy poured over white rice made something out of nearly nothing. It was salty, creamy, and smoky all at once. The smell filled the house, and the taste filled the stomach. Parents called it breakfast, but it could carry a family through an entire day. It came from kitchens that knew survival like a second language, where flavor was earned from thrift and patience. Kids grew up thinking it was comfort food, not knowing it was born from rationing and struggle. Grease gravy rice was more than a recipe. It was a declaration that no meal was too small to matter. Every bite was a promise that the family would eat, even when times were lean. It was humble food that carried pride on a spoon. Skillet Johnny Cakes brought a frontier tradition to the breakfast table in minutes. A simple batter of cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt was poured directly onto a hot, dry skillet or lightly greased with lard. The cakes cooked quickly, forming crisp edges and a tender center with a distinct corn flavor that paired well with syrup or honey if available. Their speed made them a favorite for early mornings when long workdays loomed, and their hearty texture kept hunger at bay for hours. Families often made extra to pack for travel or field chores, as Johnny Cakes held up well even when cold. This recipe's enduring popularity came from its straightforward ingredients and the way it transformed humble cornmeal into a warm, filling dish with almost no effort. Skillet Johnny Cakes embodied the practicality and resilience of cooks who needed to feed many mouths with little more than a fire and a handful of grain, keeping tradition alive through every quick golden round. If you've ever walked the streets of downtown New York, I'm sure you're familiar with the infamous pastrami on rye. If your grandma's from the Big Apple, chances are her recipe is highly regarded. This sandwich became a staple in Jewish delis in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thanks to Eastern European immigrants. This one just featured an old-fashioned slice of pastrami on rye bread and a dollop of mustard. Grandma knew that when it came to sandwiches, sometimes less is more, and pastrami on rye is the perfect example of that. But hey, don't forget no pastrami on rye is complete without a pickle on the side. The tartness of a dill pickle or the sweetness of a bread and butter pickle is the perfect contrast to the savory pastrami. Molasses glazed carrots and onions brought sweetness to supper when sugar was hard to come by. Grandmothers simmered sliced onions and carrots together in a skillet, then stirred in a spoon of dark molasses until everything shone with a sticky brown glaze. The smell alone made the house feel like Sunday afternoon even in the middle of the week. The molasses clung to the vegetables, giving them a rich, smoky sweetness that balanced their earthiness. It was the kind of side dish that needed no main course, just an appetite and a little gratitude. When sugar ran out, molasses became magic, stretching across biscuits, beans, and vegetables alike. This dish tasted like memory, slow, deep, and honest. It reminded people that hardship could still carry comfort if you knew where to look. Molasses-glazed carrots and onions were not just a side. They were a statement that Southern kitchens never stopped finding sweetness even in the darkest times. Egg pie was one of those clever recipes that turned almost nothing into something sweet, filling, and comforting. It was a custard-like pie made with eggs, milk, and whatever sugar could be spared, though during times of scarcity, molasses or syrup often took the place of refined sugar. The pie baked into a golden, slightly firm custard with a texture somewhere between flan and cake, rich yet simple. Families loved it because it felt like a true dessert, even though it relied on the most basic pantry staples. Enslaved people and their descendants carried recipes like this forward, proving that resourcefulness was its own kind of art. Egg pie was especially common in rural communities where eggs were plentiful, but luxuries like cream were rare. Each bite carried a reminder of survival and the ability to create joy from limited means. It was not just about sweetness, but about finding dignity in daily life. Over time, it became a Sunday treat, something shared after church or made for gatherings. Forgotten today, egg pie once stood as a symbol of perseverance and ingenuity. Field pea succotash carried the taste of farming life and survival, blending together what the land could provide in one hearty dish. African-American families often grew field peas, corn, and butter beans, and stewing them together created a colorful, protein-rich staple that could serve as either side or main. The sweetness of the corn balanced the earthiness of the peas, while the butter beans gave creaminess, making the combination filling enough to feed a household on its own. It was often simmered with bits of pork fat or drippings if they were available, but even without meat, it carried flavor and nourishment that kept families going through long days in the fields. Succotash was more than just a dish. It was a link back to African foodways where beans and grains were always central to survival. Families would make large pots of it for gatherings, church picnics, or everyday suppers, proving its flexibility. For many children, succotash was the dish that meant home because it was dependable and comforting. The memory of peas, corn, and beans stewed together was one of both necessity and pride, a reminder of how deeply food connected to survival and community in Black history. Red horse bread was a thrifty invention that came alive along southern riversides where fishermen fried cornmeal cakes in leftover fish grease. The name came from red horsefish, a common catch, but the bread itself became known for its smoky, savory flavor rather than its source. Cornmeal, water, and a bit of salt were pressed into patties, then fried in the sizzling grease until crisp. The result was both hearty and resourceful, turning scraps into nourishment that could feed hungry workers on long days by the river. It became a common food at fish fries, where families gathered to share meals, and it carried a taste that was hard to forget. The richness of the grease flavored the cornmeal in a way that butter never could, adding depth to something so simple. Red horse bread was practical, quick, and tied to community gatherings, becoming a remembered part of African-American river culture. Though it rarely appears today, it shaped how resourcefulness and tradition mingled in kitchens that valued every drop of flavor. Its story is one of turning necessity into custom and custom into memory that lasted well beyond the riversides. Succotash with corn and lima beans was once a mainstay at church dinners and family gatherings, a side dish simple yet deeply tied to heritage. Sweet corn and lima beans were simmered together with butter, salt, and sometimes bits of salt pork for smoky richness. The dish was colorful, nourishing, and comforting, a balance of sweetness and earthiness that paired perfectly with fried chicken or ham. Families served it in large bowls, where it disappeared quickly among the crowd. For African-American cooks, succotash carried a deeper meaning, linking back to Native American traditions and showing how old recipes survived through generations. It was practical, made from common ingredients available in gardens or markets, yet it held its own among more elaborate sides. Over time, succotash faded, replaced by casseroles and more modern recipes. But once it was a symbol of resourcefulness and history, proof that two humble ingredients could combine into something filling and beloved. It was food that carried both nourishment and cultural pride.
Number 21, shrimp and hominy. Before grits became the standard, this dish used whole hominy, coarsely ground corn soaked in lye water until the kernels swelled and split. Enslaved cooks paired it with creek shrimp caught at low tide, cooked in a single pot with salt pork. The one-pot method echoed West African porridge traditions where grain and protein cooked together, the starch thickening the broth as it simmered. This was not the polished shrimp and grits served in Charleston restaurants today. It was rougher, grainier, eaten from a bowl, not a plate. The shrimp had heads, the hominy had bite. When stone ground grits replaced whole hominy in the mid-20th century, the original dish quietly vanished, and the restaurant version that replaced it kept none of the texture. Number 25, hot water cornbread. A cast iron skillet on a coal stove in Greenwood, Mississippi, holding a 1/4 inch of bacon grease the grandmother had saved in a Folgers can since the week before. She poured boiling water over self-rising cornmeal, shaped the dough by hand into small flat discs, the way her own mother had shaped them in 1908, and slid them into the fat one at a time. The crust shattered when you broke it. Inside was steam and grit and the salt of pork. Hot water cornbread asked for nothing but cornmeal, water, and a hot pan. It fed a family of 7 for the price of a single cup of meal. If you grew up in a black household between 1930 and 1970, you know the sound of that batter hitting hot grease. The simplest bread on the table was the one that kept the body upright through the longest winters. She did not call it survival, she called it supper time. Number 20, stewed tomatoes with okra and corn. The Gula called these 3 crops the trinity of the August garden. A heavy pan went on the stove with bacon grease and chopped onion. The okra went in first and cooked down until the greens softened. Cut tomatoes followed, skins and all with their juice. Last came corn cut fresh off the cob with the back of a knife, so the milky liquid dropped into the pot. It simmered for 30 minutes, salted at the end. A family of 8 could eat off it for 2 days, like a pot that refused to empty. The dish was vegetarian by accident, not principle. There was no meat that week. A bowl of it over rice was a complete meal. The okra thickened the broth. The corn added sweetness. The tomato cut everything with acid. 3 things from your yard, 1 pot.
How cakes with butter and sugar were the sweet breakfast treat that felt almost like dessert, even though they came from the simplest ingredients in the pantry. Made from cornmeal batter poured onto a hot skillet, each cake sizzled as it spread, forming a crisp edge and soft center that tasted perfect every single time grandparents would flip them with practiced ease, stacking them high and spreading butter that melted instantly into the warm surface. A sprinkle of sugar added just enough sweetness to make the hoe cakes feel like a special morning indulgence. They were quick, affordable, and comforting. The kind of food that made children sit down fast and quiet at the table. Hoe cakes were history and home all at once, a dish born from necessity that became a beloved tradition. Even now, the memory of that buttery sweetness lingers in the minds of anyone lucky enough to grow up with them. Tomato gravy was summer in a skillet, made when gardens produced more tomatoes than families could preserve. Black mothers would cook fresh tomatoes down with bacon grease, flour, and seasonings until they formed a thick, tangy gravy that was poured over biscuits or bread. The acidity of the tomatoes balanced the richness of the grease, creating something both comforting and bright. The gravy was eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. In the 1920s South, tomato gravy meant the garden was producing and families could enjoy fresh vegetables while they lasted. Mothers made it quickly, starting with bacon grease left in the pan, adding flour to create a roux, then stirring in chopped fresh tomatoes. The mixture bubbled and thickened, filling kitchens with the smell of cooked tomatoes and pork. Children sopped it up with whatever bread was available. The dish represented seasonal eating and making the most of what grew abundantly. Today, with year-round access to tomatoes, the urgency and joy of tomato gravy has faded. Pig's feet with vinegar sauce were not for the impatient or the faint-hearted. They demanded long hours of boiling and careful cleaning before the meat turned silky soft and rich with flavor. For many families, this dish represented endurance itself, transforming what others threw away into a delicacy that filled the soul. The vinegar cut through the heaviness, adding a tang that woke the taste buds and stretched the appetite. When cooked just right, the gelatin shimmered, thickening the sauce and coating every tender bite. Pig's feet weren't glamorous, but they were honest. They told the truth about survival, about making something from nearly nothing and taking pride in it. Around tables, they sparked stories and laughter, the kind only shared by people who'd known struggle and joy in equal measure. The smell of that vinegar sauce carried through neighborhoods like a promise that good eating didn't need riches. It reminded everyone that patience, thrift, and skill could turn even the roughest ingredients into a dish worthy of celebration. Pig's feet with vinegar sauce were a triumph of flavor and faith, proof that nothing worth keeping ever comes easy. Parched corn candy was a small sweet treasure crafted from the same grain that fed the body and the spirit. Roasted corn kernels were ground fine, mixed with honey or molasses, and pressed into sticky rounds that hardened as they cooled. They were both candy and sustenance, pocket-sized energy for the weary and a rare treat for children. The flavor was smoky and sweet, a reminder of the fields that gave both labor and life. These candies were made during quiet evenings by the fire, when laughter mixed with the scent of roasted corn and syrup. Every piece was hand-shaped and precious, because sweetness was a luxury few could afford. Yet in those moments, sweetness was not just taste, it was resistance. Parched corn candy was proof that joy could be made even when the world refused to give it freely. Stewed tomatoes with bread chunks were one of those meals that looked plain but tasted like a memory. Sweet and tangy, the tomatoes simmered with butter and sugar, softening into a sauce that hugged every cube of stale bread. It was a Depression-era dish that never left because it worked, cheap, filling, and full of heart. In many Black households of the 1940s, it served as both side and supper. The bread soaked up every drop, turning soft inside and crisp around the edges. Families ate it warm, often with beans or fried meat on the side. It carried a taste of both hardship and hope, reminding everyone that comfort could come from the humblest ingredients. No one left the table hungry, and no one forgot its sweetness. Watermelon rind hash was a dish that proved nothing in a Southern kitchen ever truly went to waste. After the sweet red fruit was eaten down to its pale skin, the green rinds were peeled, diced, and saved for the next meal. They were boiled until soft, then tossed into a skillet with onions, peppers, and a pinch of spice. What came out of that pan was golden and glistening, sweet with a hint of salt, smelling faintly of summer rain and backyard laughter. The rind soaked up flavor like memory itself, turning something forgotten into something worth savoring. Families served it with cornbread or rice, sometimes even cold the next morning with eggs. It filled bellies when money was short and reminded everyone that resourcefulness could taste as good as plenty. The sizzle in the skillet sounded like hope, sharp and quick, the sign that something good was about to happen. Watermelon rind hash was not just food, it was gratitude on a plate. Every bite told the story of people who refused to waste even the smallest blessing. It was sweet, it was humble, and it carried the quiet genius of survival, transforming scraps into a celebration that no one ever forgot. Catfish nuggets turned fresh or leftover fillets into a golden feast with lightning speed. Small chunks of fish were dredged in seasoned cornmeal, their surfaces coated with a thin layer that crisped beautifully in hot oil. As the nuggets fried, the kitchen filled with the scent of the river and the satisfying crackle of fish hitting iron. Within minutes, each piece emerged with a crunchy crust and tender, flaky interior that needed little more than a squeeze of lemon or a dash of pepper. Families along southern waterways loved this recipe for its quick turnaround and ability to make a small catch stretch into a full meal. Children often grabbed the first pieces straight from the skillet, unable to wait for plates. Whether served with grits, tucked into bread, or eaten plain, these nuggets proved that fresh fish and a hot pan were all it took to bring a taste of abundance to even the humblest table. Catfish nuggets captured the essence of riverside living in every bite. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Sorghum coffee substitute was the South's answer when coffee beans disappeared from the pantry. Sorghum seeds were roasted dark until their smell turned smoky and rich, then ground fine and brewed just like coffee. The first sip tasted sweet and nutty, with a bitterness that woke you gently instead of jolting you. For farmers, mill workers, and early risers, it was warmth without the price tag, a mug full of patience, not luxury. People drank it before sunrise, sitting by wood stoves while the world was still quiet. It filled mornings with comfort and pride, showing that even when money ran short, ingenuity could still fill the cup. Grandmothers swore it gave better strength than real coffee ever could, and maybe it did, because it came from the soil they worked with their own hands. The color was deep amber, the aroma soft and familiar. Sorghum coffee was not a substitute at all. It was survival made drinkable. It reminded everyone that simplicity could be strong and that flavor did not need to come from far away. Chow chow relish was a bright, tangy condiment that made winter meals lively when fresh vegetables were long gone. Families gathered leftover garden produce, cabbage, peppers, onions, and green tomatoes, chopping and preserving them with vinegar and spices. The result was a colorful relish that added flavor to beans, greens, and meats during lean months. African American households cherished chow chow because it represented thrift and foresight, ensuring nothing from the garden went to waste. Children grew up seeing jars of chow chow lining pantry shelves, reminders of summer's abundance saved for harder days. Its tart, spicy flavor was both refreshing and practical, bringing balance to heavy meals. Making chow chow was also a communal task, with families and neighbors often working together during harvest time to prepare jars. This simple relish carried the memory of gardens, sunshine, and community into the coldest months. Though forgotten by many, it once stood as a symbol of preparation and connection. Chow chow embodied both heritage and survival, proof that even scraps could create joy. Carolina pea rice was a low-country dish that tied directly to African rice-growing traditions carried across the ocean by enslaved people. Families simmered cowpeas with rice, often adding lard, ham hocks, or smoked pork bones to build flavor. The rice gave bulk, the peas supplied protein, and the pork scraps brought depth, turning simple ingredients into something filling and satisfying. It was more than just a meal. It was a continuation of African foodways that shaped entire landscapes while feeding generations creatively. In poor households, pea rice was an efficient way to stretch resources, ensuring that everyone at the table could eat well. It was both ordinary and special, appearing in daily suppers but also at larger community gatherings. For children, it was the taste of home, reliable and comforting. For adults, it was heritage, survival, and pride served on a plate. Carolina pea rice remains a dish of resilience and culture. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes were one of the most straightforward yet comforting foods for communities with little to spare. Whole sweet potatoes were buried under hot embers and left to cook slowly until their skins blackened and their centers grew soft and caramel sweet. They needed no pans or ovens, just fire and patience, making them a practical food for enslaved people and poor farmers alike. Many ate them plain with a pinch of salt, while others drizzled molasses for extra richness. Sweet potatoes stored well through winter months, making them a dependable staple when gardens were bare. Pulling one from the ashes and eating it steaming hot was a memory tied to both nourishment and comfort. It was a small joy that brightened otherwise difficult days. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes were humble, thrifty, and deeply satisfying. A forgotten recipe that once stood as proof of resilience and resourceful living. Homemade Brunswick stew was a dish built for community, simmered in large pots to feed crowds at gatherings, reunions, and church events. The recipe combined chicken, beans, corn, tomatoes, and sometimes leftover meats, creating a hearty mixture that filled bowls and satisfied hunger. Its origins stretched across the South, but African-American cooks made it their own, adding flavors and techniques that turned thrift into comfort. Families remembered the sight of steaming pots at outdoor events where the stew cooked for hours until flavors blended into a rich, savory whole. Cornbread was the perfect companion, soaking up the juices. The stew was frugal, using what was available, but it carried with it a spirit of abundance because there was always enough to share. Over time, it became less common to see such pots at gatherings, as convenience foods replaced them. But homemade Brunswick stew remains a memory of community, tradition, and the joy of a dish meant for sharing. It was food that fed not just stomachs, but also bonds between neighbors and families.
Number 24, Limpin' Susan. If Hoppin' John was the famous sibling, Limpin' Susan was the one nobody talked about. This dish combined okra and rice, two crops that came directly from West Africa, cooked together in bacon drippings until the okra broke down into a silky sauce that bound the rice into something closer to a porridge than a pilaf. The name likely came from the way the dish moved on the plate, loose and unsteady, unlike the firm, dry texture of its pea-based cousin. Gullah families on the Sea Islands served it as a side or a full meal depending on what else was available. It required almost nothing. Rice, okra, a little fat. That simplicity was its strength and its undoing. When convenience foods arrived, dishes that took patience disappeared first. Number 24, salt pork and lima beans. The smell hit the kitchen the moment the lid came off the pot. Imagine it. Salt pork rendered slow in its own fat, lima beans soaked overnight in well water, an onion the grandmother had pulled from the garden behind the smokehouse. She let the pot simmer for 4 hours on the back of a wood stove in Tuscaloosa while she worked the cotton field across the road. The beans broke down into a thick, pale stew that coated the spoon like cream coats a finger. A tenant farm family of 6 in 1941 received 22 pounds of salt pork and 100 pounds of cornmeal as their monthly ration. Day after day, that was the whole month. This dish was how that ration stretched. If your grandmother grew up in the Black Belt of Alabama, you have tasted this pot. The protein was small, the flavor was enormous. Her granddaughter still keeps the recipe folded inside a hymnal. Number 24, cornmeal hoe cakes. They're named for the iron hoe a field worker would heat over coals as a griddle when no skillet was around. The batter was 3 things: white stone ground cornmeal, salt and water enough for a thick paste, no leavening, no buttermilk. A spoonful went onto the hot iron and crisped like a coin in 2 minutes. You flipped it with a knife and finished it in another minute. A grandmother on Wadmalaw Island could make 20 in the time you take to wash your hands. They were eaten with cane syrup, with a smear of lard, or torn into a bowl of pot liquor from the greens. It was simple, cheap, and it traveled. A field hand could carry 6 in a flour sack and eat them cold at noon.
Fried salmon patties for breakfast might seem unusual today, but for many African American families in the 60s and 70s, canned salmon was a dependable pantry staple that worked for any meal of the day. Grandparents mixed the salmon with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasoning, shaping it into patties that sizzled in the skillet until crisp. The smell filled the kitchen with something hearty and inviting, a bold start to the morning that made you feel ready for whatever the day demanded. Served with grits or biscuits, the patties tasted rich and satisfying, proof that canned ingredients could create meals full of flavor and comfort. Salmon was not expensive, but it felt special, which made breakfast feel special too. Children grew used to that savory taste long before they ever tried a restaurant version. Fried salmon patties were practical, filling, and unforgettable, a reminder of how creativity in the kitchen shaped so many childhood mornings. hog head cheese was true nose-to-tail cooking, transforming the pig's head into a savory, jellied loaf that fed families for days. Black mothers boiled the entire head with onions, bay leaves, and spices until the meat fell from the bone and the broth thickened with natural gelatin. The meat was picked clean, chopped finely, and mixed back into the reduced broth before being poured into pans to set. Once chilled, the mixture solidified into a firm loaf that could be sliced and served cold or fried. The texture was unique, tender meat suspended in savory jelly, with flavors that were rich and deeply satisfying. In the 1920s, hog head cheese appeared at Sunday dinners, church gatherings, and special occasions, sliced thin and eaten with crackers or bread. Mothers made it because it used parts that would otherwise be discarded. The process took hours, but yielded protein that lasted through the week. Hog head cheese represented both skill and respect. Skill in transforming unusual cuts into something delicious, and respect for the animal that sustained the family. Fried green tomatoes were born from gardens that didn't wait for ripeness. When the first chill of the season came, folks picked what was left and turned those hard, tart fruits into something golden. Each slice was dipped in cornmeal, salt, and maybe a pinch of cayenne before hitting the hot oil. The sizzle filled the kitchen with anticipation, and soon the edges browned into crispy perfection. The result was tangy, crunchy, and bright, a surprise of flavor from something most would toss aside. Fried green tomatoes weren't wasteful. They were wise. They showed how ingenuity could turn limitation into delight. Families ate them hot, sometimes with gravy or between slices of bread, savoring the mix of sour and savor. They were the taste of transition, of seasons changing and hands adapting. In every crisp bite was a lesson passed down quietly. Nothing should go unused, and patience is a form of love. Fried green tomatoes may have started as necessity, but they ended as Southern tradition, proof that creativity could turn the unripe into the unforgettable. Molasses stack cake was not just a dessert, it was a symbol of togetherness, born from scarcity and shared effort. Each layer of cake was baked by a different hand, carried from one household to another, and stacked high with thick, sweet molasses or sorghum syrup in between. It was often made for weddings or church gatherings, where every family contributed what little they had. The syrup soaked through the layers overnight, turning a once simple cake into something soft, dark, and deeply flavored with spice. Its sweetness wasn't loud, it was patient, like the people who made it. The scent of ginger and sorghum filled kitchens built on faith and firewood, where every bite reminded families that joy could rise even out of hardship. To cut into a stack cake was to taste community itself, one layer of generosity at a time, held together by the sweetness of shared survival. Black-eyed pea fritters were music made edible, the sound of memory sizzling in oil. Ground from soaked peas and mixed with chopped onions, peppers, and spice, the batter was shaped and dropped carefully into bubbling fat, the outside crisp to a deep gold, while the inside stayed soft and warm. These fritters were born from West African roots, carried through generations of women who cooked by touch and taste, not by paper. In church kitchens and on street corners, they were sold beside fish and greens, feeding both hunger and hope. Black mothers in the 1940s made them by feel, never needing a recipe to remember what their hands already knew. Each one fried was a connection to history, to flavor passed quietly through resilience. They tasted of salt, smoke, and pride. Children waited for the first batch, reaching in before they cooled. Every crunch was a hymn to heritage, proof that joy could survive even in scarcity. Black-eyed pea fritters were not just food, they were memory kept alive in the pan. Mud pie was not the dessert people think of today, but a savory meal that brought warmth when meat was scarce. It began with mashed potatoes, thick and creamy from yesterday's supper, spread across the bottom of a pan. A layer of bread crusts came next, torn from loaves that had grown stiff with time. Then came a pour of rich brown gravy, made from drippings and flour, seeping into the bread and potatoes like rain into soil. When it baked, the top turned dark and glossy, the inside soft and heavy with flavor. It looked muddy, hence its name, but it tasted like comfort itself. Families made it on Sundays, when scraps were gathered and hope was baked back into the week. The smell filled the house and called everyone to the table. Children fought for the crispy corners while parents smiled in quiet relief. Mud pie carried pride in every bite, the kind of pride that came from making something out of almost nothing. It was a meal that felt like a miracle, served hot from the oven and eaten slow, one spoonful at a time, a reminder that even hard days could end sweetly. Peanut stew with rice was a bold, nourishing dish born from West African traditions and adapted to the speed of a 10-minute meal. Leftover rice from yesterday's supper warmed quickly, while a handful of peanuts was ground into a paste and thinned with hot water to create a creamy sauce. Onions and garlic sautéed in a little fat gave the stew a savory backbone as the peanut mixture bubbled into a fragrant gravy. If there was a scrap of smoked meat or a pinch of chili pepper, it found its way into the pot. But even without extras, the flavor was deep and rich. When poured over hot rice, the stew coated every grain, providing protein and comfort in each bite. Families cherish this recipe for its speed and its tie to ancestral flavors, a taste of heritage that fit neatly into a hurried morning or a weary evening. In the toughest days, it proved that tradition and survival could share the same bowl. So far, we have two solid options for salads with a sandwich variation for one of them, but what if you do not like protein in your salads? Want them on the sweeter, more dessert-y side? Then molded cranberry orange salads have your name written on them wrapped up in a bow. Some normal or raspberry gelatin and frozen cranberries, plus apples and oranges cut into wedges, would make for an incredibly sweet and delightful salad that had everything you wanted in it taste-wise. It also did wonders for your skin with a steady supply of vitamins and the benefits of cranberries. So not only would grandmothers make this for their beloved families, but they would sneak a bowl on the side for themselves too. Despite the ingredients being relatively easy to get, this was more of an upper-class dish popular in affluent areas. Homemade syrup bread was born in kitchens where sugar, eggs, and butter had all run dry. Cooks would mix coarse flour with syrup water, baking it slow until it came out dark, sticky, and fragrant. The crust turned crisp while the inside stayed tender, sweetened not by plenty but by invention. It was a bread that tasted of molasses and hard work, the kind that made plain coffee taste richer. Every slice was heavy in the hand, soft in the mouth, and filled with the scent of survival. Families tore it apart with their fingers, letting the syrup glaze stick to their skin. It was eaten for breakfast or supper, depending on what the day offered, and always left you wanting one more bite. Homemade syrup bread taught cooks that sweetness did not come from sugar, but from persistence. It was a reminder that warmth could rise from even the barest pantry. When times were hardest, this bread made people feel human again, loved, fed, and home. Wild green salad was one of the most direct connections to the land, born from the practice of foraging. Families gathered dandelion greens, pokeweed, or mustard leaves from fields and woods, washing and dressing them simply with vinegar or fat drippings. These greens were free, abundant, and full of nutrition, making them invaluable when money and resources were scarce. For enslaved people, foraging was sometimes the only way to add freshness and variety to an otherwise meager diet. The salads were sharp, tangy, and nourishing, teaching families that the land itself could provide. Later generations continued to gather wild greens, passing down knowledge of which plants were safe and when to pick them. These salads were not just food, but a link to both survival and tradition, carrying cultural memory through taste. Today, wild green salad is nearly forgotten, but it remains a reminder of resilience and ingenuity. It shows how African American kitchens created abundance from what others overlooked. Cane syrup glazed sweet potatoes turned a humble root into something festive and sweet. Families baked sliced or halved potatoes in cast iron skillets, coating them with thick cane syrup as they roasted. The syrup caramelized, creating a sticky glaze that made the dish feel indulgent, almost like dessert, though it was often served as a side. Cane syrup was cheaper than refined sugar, and easier to find in rural communities, while sweet potatoes were abundant in gardens or markets, making the pairing both thrifty and dependable. Families prepared the dish for Sunday dinners, holidays, and community gatherings because it felt special without requiring much cost. Children remembered the smell of syrup filling the house, while adults saw it as proof that creativity could turn ordinary roots into a dish worth celebrating. Cane syrup glazed sweet potatoes stand today as a reminder of thrift, resilience, and joy, crafted from simple, affordable ingredients. Fried rabbit was once a common meal in farm households, a dish that turned necessity into comfort. Rabbits were plentiful, either raised in hutches or hunted in fields, and they provided meat that was lean, tender, and adaptable. The meat was cut into pieces, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried much like chicken, creating a golden crust with juicy meat inside. Families served it with mashed potatoes, greens, or cornbread, making it a centerpiece of both weekday meals and special gatherings. For children, fried rabbit was often indistinguishable from chicken, but adults knew it as a food tied to thrift and survival. It was resourceful cooking, making use of what the land provided. Over time, rabbits disappeared from most tables, replaced by store-bought chicken and beef. Yet fried rabbit was once a symbol of resilience and creativity in African American kitchens, proof that nothing was wasted and everything could be turned into comfort food with skill and care.
Number 23, crab rice. Blue crabs were so plentiful along the Charleston waterfront in the 18th and 19th centuries that enslaved fishermen pulled them from the creeks by hand. The rice came from the same fields those men and women worked. Crab rice put both crops and catch in a single pot, seasoned with onion, salt, and whatever pepper was available. The technique mirrored the one-pot rice dishes of the Senegambian coast, where protein and grain cooked together in the same vessel, the steam doing the work. Gula families on James Island and Johns Island made crab rice through the 1970s. It never appeared in mainstream cookbooks because nobody thought to write it down. The people who knew how to make it were not the people publishers asked. Number 20, hoe cakes on a griddle. A black field cook in Beaufort County, South Carolina, shaped wet cornmeal into flat rounds with the heel of her hand and slid them onto a hot iron hoe she had borrowed from the tool shed. The cornmeal hissed and seized into a cake the size of a palm. She cooked 12 at a time for the men working the rice fields. The crust was rough, the inside was warm and dense, and tasted of grain, salt, and wood smoke. Hoe cakes traveled from West African fritter traditions through the slave quarters of the Low Country into the lunch pails of free black laborers a century later. They cost almost nothing. If your great-grandfather worked a field anywhere south of the Mason-Dixon, he ate one for his noon meal. The grandmother who fed those men never wrote her name on a single recipe. Number 11, smothered cabbage with sweet onion. A whole green cabbage was quartered, cored, and cut into chunks. A sweet onion the size of your fist was sliced thin. Both went into your heavy iron skillet with a piece of salt pork rendered down to a glassy fat. You covered the pan, turned the heat low, and walked away like trusting a slow friend. 20 minutes later, your cabbage had collapsed to a third of its volume and turned a soft golden brown along every edge. A pinch of salt, a heavy crack of black pepper. That was the whole thing. The sweetness of the onion, the smoke of the pork, the slight bitterness of the long-cooked cabbage. A bowl over rice was a complete supper. A cabbage cost a quarter at your country store in 1960. The salt pork was already in your pantry. The dish was the Sea Island answer to what to make when your garden had nothing left.
Rice and raisins with butter was the kind of breakfast that felt like a treat, even though it came from the most basic pantry ingredients a household always had on hand. Long before sugary cereal brands took over the shelves, many families started their day with a warm bowl of rice simmered until soft and mixed with sweet raisins that plumped in the heat. a pat of butter melted over the top, coating each grain and adding richness that made the dish feel far more indulgent than its low cost suggested. It was warm, steady, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that felt like a hug before school or chores. Grandparents made it because rice was cheap, raisins lasted forever in a jar, and butter brought everything together in a way that tasted wholesome and familiar. Some added a sprinkle of sugar, others a dash of cinnamon, but most kept it simple, letting the steam rise like a quiet morning ritual. The flavor was gentle, the sweetness mild, and the bowl always seemed to disappear faster than expected. For many families, this dish was tied to winter mornings, cold floors, and the feeling of being cared for before the day even started. Even today, people who grew up with rice and raisins remember the way it filled the house with warmth and made them feel ready for anything. Pot liquor greens were more than side dishes. They were medicine, nourishment, and tradition simmered into one pot. Black mothers boiled collard, turnip, or mustard greens for hours with smoked meat, creating a dark, mineral-rich broth that pooled at the bottom. This broth, called pot liquor, carried vitamins, iron, and the essence of everything cooked together. Children were given cupfuls to drink or used cornbread to soak up every drop, ensuring nothing was wasted. The greens themselves became tender and silky, flavored deeply by the pork. In the 1920s South, pot liquor was considered healing, given to sick children, nursing mothers, and anyone who needed strength. Mothers knew the broth held more nutrition than the greens themselves, reheating it for days. Families drank it warm in the morning or poured it over bread. Pot liquor greens represented the philosophy of using everything, wasting nothing. Today, the broth is often thrown away, but Black mothers in the 1920s knew it was liquid gold. Sugar drip pie was dessert for the days when sweetness seemed out of reach. Born from scarcity, it used nothing more than flour, butter, and a syrup made from sugar, molasses, or sorghum. The filling bubbled thick in the oven, settling into a caramelized custard that smelled like home. There were no apples, no berries, no milk, just imagination and a deep craving for something sweet. The crust, often rolled thin to save on ingredients, baked to a perfect crispness, holding the sticky richness within. This pie wasn't about indulgence. It was about gratitude. Families sliced it into small pieces, savoring every bite like a treasure. The taste was deep and smoky, with hints of burnt sugar that reminded people of what endurance could create. Sugar drip pie was proof that luxury didn't come from plenty. It came from the hands that made do. It turned simplicity into satisfaction and reminded everyone that joy doesn't need abundance to feel complete. A bite of it could make even the hardest day end a little softer. Molasses apple dumplings were small bundles of joy wrapped in dough and baked in bubbling syrup. Whole apples were peeled, cored, and stuffed with brown sugar and spice, then folded into pastry made from the simplest ingredients: flour, lard, and a pinch of hope. As they baked, the molasses caramelized into a thick, sticky sauce that clung to the edges like honey. The scent alone could fill a home with warmth, even when winter winds pressed hard against the walls. Families made them during harvest season, a celebration of labor and reward, of fruit gathered and shared. They were sweet, tart, and heavy with meaning, the taste of both work and rest. The sauce was spooned over each dumpling as it came out of the oven, pooling into a dark, glossy sweetness that felt like abundance. Each bite melted between the teeth, soft and fragrant, carrying traces of cinnamon and smoke. Served with milk or cream if one was lucky, these dumplings carried comfort through generations. In their syrupy folds lived the story of people who refused to let hardship steal the sweetness from their table, who baked hope into every humble crust. Turnip greens pot liquor soup was a kind of medicine that healed without a doctor. The rich, dark broth left behind after boiling greens, that was the pot liquor, full of vitamins, salt, and strength. Black mothers knew not to throw it away. Instead, they poured it into bowls, sopped it up with cornbread, or saved it for the next day's soup. Sometimes they added beans, onions, or bits of smoked meat, but even plain, it tasted like recovery. It was the liquid memory of the greens themselves, transformed from humble scraps into sustenance. Pot liquor warmed bones, soothed throats, and revived tired bodies after long hours of labor. In the 1940s, it was called the poor man's tonic, but those who drank it knew it was richer than that. It carried the spirit of survival, the wisdom to see value in what others might discard. It was not waste, it was legacy, the knowledge that strength lives in the simplest things. Each bowl connected the present to a long line of women who made nourishment from nearly nothing. The flavor was deep and smoky, the taste of history passed through water. Pot liquor was more than soup, it was soul-preserved in liquid form. Hominy crackle porridge was the kind of breakfast that came from patience, not plenty. When there was no bacon, no biscuits, and not much else in the pantry, leftover hominy saved the day. It was stirred into a pot with water or milk, sweetened with molasses, and spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon if you had it. The sound of the spoon scraping against the pot made a rhythm that felt almost like music, slow and steady like morning itself. When the porridge bubbled, it released a scent both earthy and rich, a blend of smoke, sugar, and warmth. Children would sit waiting with chipped bowls in their hands, ready for the first ladle. It was thick and creamy, sometimes with a thin golden crust if it sat long enough. Hominy crackle porridge filled bellies and lifted moods, turning scraps into something special. It reminded families that sweetness did not depend on sugar alone, but on love and endurance. Every spoonful was a story of thrift and tenderness, made from what was left and shared without complaint. When the bowl was empty, people still felt full, not just from the food, but from the comfort it brought to a hard world made softer by care. Spiced chickpea patties gave humble canned beans a lively, protein-rich makeover in record time. Chickpeas were drained, mashed with a fork, and seasoned with garlic, onion, and a sprinkle of warm spices like paprika or cumin before being shaped into small rounds. A quick sear in a hot skillet formed a crisp crust while the inside stayed creamy and fragrant. These patties delivered hearty flavor and satisfying texture without the need for meat, making them a welcome change for families stretching their resources. Served inside bread, alongside greens, or simply eaten by hand, they proved versatile and filling. Cooks appreciated how a single can of beans could feed several people in less than 10 minutes, turning pantry staples into a meal that felt far from ordinary. Spiced chickpea patties demonstrated the creativity and resilience of cooks, who refused to settle for bland food even in difficult times, bringing bold taste and quick comfort to tables where every minute and every ingredient mattered. Pickled pig's feet. Salad was a dish that startled the tongue but stayed in memory. The gelatinous cuts of pig's feet, slow-cooked and cooled, were diced and tossed with onions, peppers, and a sharp vinegar dressing. It was a cold dish, tangy and bright, served in small bowls at Sunday gatherings or alongside biscuits. The flavor was bold, salty, sour, and strong enough to wake the senses. For some, it was a delicacy. For others, a taste they learned to love out of respect for what their elders cherished. It was food with character, no pretending, no disguising what it was. Pickled pig's feet. Salad reminded people that Southern cooking had no waste, no shame, only pride in the craft of using every part of what was given. It was eaten slow, with talk and laughter, a dish meant to be remembered as much as tasted. Blackstrap molasses tea was one of those drinks that blurred the line between medicine and comfort. A spoonful of molasses stirred into hot water created a dark, sweet drink that was rich in iron and minerals. Families drank it not only for warmth but also for health, since molasses was believed to restore strength and energy. It was especially common among African American households that valued both thrift and tradition. Children sipped it when they were sick or tired, while adults drank it to stretch resources in place of more expensive beverages. The flavor was strong, earthy, and bittersweet, carrying the taste of history in every sip. For many, it represented more than a drink. It was a way of caring for the body and soul when little else was available. Forgotten now, blackstrap molasses tea once stood as both comfort and remedy. proving that even the simplest kitchen staples could hold power. Batter-fried eggplant was a Depression-era dish that reflected the need to make vegetables taste like meat when meat was too expensive to buy. African-American families sliced eggplants, dipped them in seasoned flour or cornmeal batter, and fried them in hot fat until golden brown. The result was crisp on the outside, tender on the inside, and hearty enough to mimic the texture of fried cutlets. This trick allowed families to bring variety to their tables while still feeding everyone on a small budget. For children, the crunchy coating made it feel like a treat, while adults knew it was a clever way to make something from the garden feel indulgent. It became popular because it was simple, affordable, and adaptable, with different households seasoning it in their own ways. Batter-fried eggplant stood as proof that frugality could also bring satisfaction, turning vegetables into meals worth remembering.
Number 16, she crab soup. The version served in Charleston restaurants today bears little resemblance to its origin. Enslaved and later free gula cooks in wealthy Charleston kitchens created it using female blue crabs specifically for the roe, the bright orange eggs that gave the soup its color and its name. The base was cream, butter, and crab stock, thickened with the natural richness of the roe itself. It was a spring dish made only when female crabs were carrying eggs. White Charleston families claimed it as their own. Cookbooks attributed it to plantation mistresses who never stood over a stove. The Gullah women who invented it went unnamed. Today, the roe is gone. So is the credit. Number 15, souse meat and crackers. A butcher's wife in Birmingham in 1944 boiled a pig's head for 6 hours in a kettle of vinegar and salt water with bay leaves and red pepper flakes she had dried on the windowsill the August before. She picked the meat from the bone with her fingers the way a woman picks the last pecans from the bottom of a paper sack, packed it into loaf pans, poured the strained broth over the top, and set the pans in the icebox overnight. By morning, the broth had set into a firm pink jelly studded with shreds of pink meat. She served it with hot mustard and pickles. Souse was Saturday afternoon food. It was the meat that came from the part of the hog the white grocers sold for almost nothing. It tasted like vinegar and pork and patience. Working men ate it from wax paper at the lumber yard. Number 12, collard greens with smoked turkey neck. A pile of collards came in from your garden. Big leaves, dark and crinkled, washed in 3 changes of cold water until the grit was gone. You stripped each leaf off its tough center stem, stacked them, rolled them, and cut them into thin ribbons like green confetti. A smoked turkey neck went into a heavy pot with water, garlic, a chopped onion, and a tablespoon of bacon grease. It simmered for an hour to make a broth. The greens went in next and cooked for another hour and a half until they collapsed into a tender, dark green tangle and your broth turned almost black. A splash of vinegar at the end, a dash of red pepper flakes, a bowl with the pot liquor and cornbread to sop it up. In Gullah Geechee culture, greens on your New Year table mean money in the coming year. Even families that ate greens every week of their lives still made a fresh pot on January 1st. The symbolism mattered as much as the flavor.
Scrapple slices were one of the most resourceful breakfasts older generations relied on, especially in regions where nothing from the pig went to waste. Scrapple mixed pork scraps with cornmeal and spices, forming a loaf that could be sliced and fried until crisp on the outside and soft on the inside. Grandparents cooked it in a hot skillet, letting each piece form that perfect golden crust that crackled slightly under the fork. It was savory, hearty, and deeply rooted in tradition, a dish born from the idea that every ingredient had value. Some families ate it plain, others added syrup or mustard, but no matter how it was served, scrapple had a distinctive flavor that stayed with you. It tasted like farm mornings, like smoke rising from cast iron pans, like a time when food came from skill rather than convenience. Children might turn up their noses at the idea today, but to those who grew up on it, scrapple was a breakfast that meant strength, thrift, and the comfort of knowing a meal would always be there. Even now, the memory of that sizzling sound brings people back to early mornings in small kitchens where tradition guided the skillet. Sweet potato pone was dense, spiced, and deeply satisfying, made by grating raw sweet potatoes and mixing them with molasses, spices, and just enough flour to bind. Black mothers baked pone in cast-iron pans, creating a dessert that was somewhere between pudding and cake. The texture was moist and heavy, with grated potato creating structure and natural sweetness. Molasses added depth and color, while spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger provided warmth. The result was dark, sticky, and incredibly filling. In the 1920s, sweet potato pone appeared regularly because sweet potatoes were easy to grow and store through winter. Mothers made pone for Sunday desserts, church gatherings, and special occasions. It required minimal ingredients and could be made year-round from stored potatoes. The dessert represented agricultural abundance and the ability to create sweetness from garden produce. Children loved pone's dense texture and deep molasses flavor. The dish was never light or delicate. It was substantial and earthy. Sweet potato pone has been overshadowed by sweet potato pie, but the original pone had a character all its own. Smothered pork chops turned thrift into something tender and rich. In small kitchens where nothing was wasted, a little flour, onion, and grease could turn a cheap cut into a dish that felt like Sunday. The chops sizzled in cast iron until browned, then simmered under a blanket of thick gravy that pulled every bit of flavor from the bones. The air would fill with the smell of caramelized onion and seasoned fat, the kind of scent that made you stop and smile before supper even began. Rice or mashed potatoes waited on the side, ready to soak up every drop. Smothered pork chops weren't about perfection, they were about care. The sauce was stirred slow, the meat turned gentle, and time did the rest. Families ate in silence at first, just the sound of forks scraping plates and sighs of satisfaction. This dish was kitchen wisdom at its best, turning small means into deep comfort. It was a meal that spoke softly, but stayed with you long after, reminding you that home could always be found in a pan of gravy. Caramel bread pudding was born in the corners of quiet kitchens, where nothing was wasted and everything had purpose. Day-old bread soaked in milk, eggs, and sugar became a dessert of astonishing richness once baked with a drizzle of caramelized syrup. The edges crisped, while the inside stayed soft and custard-like, every bite warm and buttery with a hint of burnt sugar. It was the sort of dessert that stretched humble ingredients to their full glory, comforting, dependable, and generous. People made it after Sunday supper or for gatherings, serving it straight from the pan with spoons and laughter. The sweetness wasn't just in the taste, it was in the act of turning leftovers into something beautiful. The caramel, cooked just long enough to darken but not burn, gave depth to the flavor, transforming simplicity into elegance. Sometimes raisins or nuts were added, sometimes a dash of spice. But the heart of the dish remained the same, resourcefulness turned delicious. Caramel bread pudding was not a dish of luxury, but of gratitude, a way of saying that even what seemed forgotten still had worth, that love could be reheated and shared again. Cornmeal mush squares were the breakfast that worked as hard as the women who made them. At night, cornmeal simmered with salt and water until thick, poured into a tin pan, and left to cool on the windowsill. By morning, it had set firm enough to slice. Black mothers would cut it into neat squares, fry them crisp on the outside, and serve them hot with cane syrup or just a drizzle of milk. It was plain food, but it carried pride. Every square was golden and sturdy, the kind of breakfast that fueled long days in fields, factories, and kitchens. Nothing went to waste. Yesterday's mush became tomorrow's meal. The scent of frying corn filled the house like a promise that the day would begin right. It was the taste of discipline softened by care, a dish that belonged equally to workdays and Sundays. Cornmeal mush squares taught generations that nourishment was not about plenty, but about purpose. Each bite held the warmth of thrift, the echo of hands stirring in the quiet hours before dawn, and the certainty that love could take even the simplest grain and make it strong enough to start the morning. Churned milk soup was what you made when you had finished making butter and still needed a meal. That leftover buttermilk became the base for a tangy, hearty soup that could feed a family from a single pot. It was mixed with cornmeal, herbs, and whatever vegetables were on hand, then simmered until it thickened like velvet. The smell was sharp but cozy, filling the kitchen with warmth and familiarity. Some families dropped bits of bread into the bowl, letting it soak up the flavor. It was simple food, born from old farm routines and frugal wisdom. Churned milk soup taught that nothing should ever be wasted, not even the scraps of a good day's work. It soothed hunger and reminded everyone that comfort could come from the most ordinary things. With each spoonful, it carried the echo of laughter and work from generations before. Molasses milk bread toast made the most of day-old loaves, turning scraps into a sweet, rich treat without wasting a crumb. Thick slices of slightly stale bread were dipped in a quick bath of warm milk to soften their edges, then fried in butter until golden and crisp. As the bread sizzled, its scent filled the kitchen, signaling a breakfast that felt indulgent despite its humble origins. A drizzle of deep, dark molasses added a caramel-like sweetness that soaked into every crevice, creating a dessert-like breakfast ready in minutes. Children often crowded around the stove waiting for their share, and adults cherished the comfort of something warm and sweet before a day of work. This recipe turned leftovers into a celebration, a reminder that resourcefulness could create moments of pleasure even in lean times. Molasses milk bread toast remains a testament to frugality and flavor, proof that yesterday's bread and a spoonful of syrup could still bring smiles to the morning table. Parched corn was one of the oldest and simplest foods, carried forward from Native American and African traditions. Whole kernels were dried, then roasted until crunchy, creating a portable snack that kept well for long periods. For African American families, parched corn was both sustenance and heritage, a food that tied them to land and memory. It could be eaten plain, mixed into stews, or carried in pockets for long days in the fields. Children often enjoyed it like candy, crunching on kernels between meals. Adults appreciated its practicality, since it was inexpensive and easy to make in large batches. Enslaved people carried parched corn as a travel ration, proof of its importance for survival. The taste was earthy, nutty, and simple, but it carried enormous meaning, reminding families of endurance. Forgotten now, parched corn was once a cornerstone of resilience, teaching that even the humblest foods could sustain life.
Number 18, seafood perlo. The word perlo comes from pilau, which traces its low country lineage through the Senegambian jollof rice tradition. In West Africa, rice cooked with fish or meat in a single pot was not a recipe, it was a way of life. Charleston's version used whatever the water offered, shrimp, crab, oysters, or all three, layered with rice and seasoned with onion, salt, and hot pepper. The rice absorbed the broth as it cooked, each grain distinct but stained with the color of the pot. Gula families on Edisto Island and Wadmalaw Island made seafood perlu for Sunday dinners and funerals alike. It was the dish that appeared when something mattered. Supermarket convenience meals made the slow version seem like an indulgence nobody could afford. Number 16, syrup sandwiches were among the most iconic survival lunches in African American households, requiring nothing more than bread and thick molasses or sorghum. Families spread dark syrup generously between slices of whatever bread was available, creating a meal that was sweet, filling, and cost almost nothing. The syrup provided quick energy through natural sugars, while bread offered carbohydrates to sustain workers and children through long hours. In rural southern communities, sorghum was often homemade from stalks grown in family gardens, making this lunch essentially free. Children carried these sandwiches to school wrapped in cloth, eating them at midday without shame because everyone understood survival. The sweetness masked what was essentially poverty, transforming scarcity into something children actually look forward to eating. Number 15, smoked mullet. The mullet schooled in your inland creeks and could be cast netted by one person with patience. The fish was split, salted, and laid skin down on a wire rack over a smoldering fire of oak and hickory in a small backyard smokehouse. It smoked for 6 hours over very low heat until the flesh turned a deep amber and the skin pulled away clean like bark off a tree. A whole smoked mullet kept for a week in your cool pantry without refrigeration. Your grandmother on a disto would flake it onto cornbread with a slice of raw onion and call it lunch. The fish carried so much flavor that no sauce was needed. No butter, no lemon. The smoke had done the work. Mullet has fallen out of favor on most American menus. On the sea islands, it's still pulled out of the creek the same way it was 100 years ago.
Coffee milk for kids was one of those small morning rituals that made children feel grown, even though the drink was mostly warm milk with only a tiny splash of coffee. Parents and grandparents mixed it carefully, just enough coffee to tint the milk a light tan and add the faintest whisper of that roasted smell adults relied on to start their day. It was soothing, warm, and familiar. The kind of drink that made sleepy children perk up before school without giving them the full strength of adult coffee. Many African American households use this as a way to include children in the morning rhythm, letting them feel part of the adult world while still keeping things gentle. The taste was mild and slightly sweet, especially when a bit of sugar was added, and it had a comforting creaminess that stuck with you long after the cup was empty. The mornings felt quieter back then, slower, filled with the soft sounds of spoons stirring and radios humming low in the background. Coffee milk was not just a drink, it was a moment, a shared start to the day that made you feel loved and included. Even now, the memory of that warm cup brings people back to kitchens filled with steam, conversation, and the steady comfort of family.
Those were the recipes that kept families together. If your grandmother made something you did not see on this list, share it in the comments, because those dishes deserve to be remembered too. And if this felt like sitting in your grandmother's kitchen again, subscribe so you never miss another trip back. From Big Mama Skillet, thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these traditions alive.